Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ghost in the Machine in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 5, B Memories of Dust. Commencing system check. Memory unit, green. Initializing tactics log. Loading geographic data. Vitals, green. I don't like this idea, Chara. WH, what? And no, I'm not. BIG kids don't cry. Yeah, you're right. No. I'd never doubt you, Chara. Never. Why, yeah. We'll be strong. We'll free everyone. Remaining MP, 100%. Black box temperature, normal. Black box internal pressure, normal. Where is the other one? Activating IFF. Activating FCS. Initializing pod connection. Unable to establish a connection to the bunker. Proposal, find a position free of signal interference. Launching DBU setup. Activating inertia control system. Activating environmental sensors. 2B, are you alright? 2B. Equipment status, green. All systems green. Combat preparations complete _. 2B squeezed herself free of the wreckage of her mangled flight unit, setting foot on the grassy, flower-dotted soil coating the ground. All around her were the tall, sloped walls of an enormous cavernous grotto, the only light coming from a small aperture in the ceiling dozens of meters above. Muted sunlight filtered through the thick air and illuminated motes of dust floating in languid spirals on gentle updrafts. Buttercups with wide, bright yellow petals swayed gently, disturbed by 2B's footfalls. On the other side of the cavern stood crumbling pillars, a weathered and eroded brick wall, and a yawning, arched doorway lined by flickering, dimly lit torches. 2B9's laid a steady hand on her shoulder as she pulled her arms free of the wrecked craft. Any damage? 9's. 2B's mind raced. The last thing she remembered was the throne room and the king, and 9's. But yes. Why was she back here? How? And how was 9's still alive? Before she knew it, 2B had thrown her arms around him. 9's just stood there as 2B squeezed him tighter, unaccustomed to 2B's uncharacteristic behavior. He gingerly hugged her back and gave her an awkward, stiff pat on the back. Of course, I'm alive, 2B. You're the one who crashed. Thanks, 9's, S9's. 2B pulled herself away from her partner, coughing nervously into her sleeve before stiffly saluting. Thank you, 9's. 2B, 9's smiled. It wasn't fair that he looked so boyish and innocent when he smiled. I'm just glad you're okay. I'm supposed to look after you, remember? 2B took a deep breath and calmed her nerves, retreating back behind her icy facade. 9's, does this all seem familiar to you? She asked, wondering if 9's really didn't remember that all this had happened before. Familiar? 9's frowned as he studied the surrounding environment. I mean, caves like these kinda blur together, but other than that, can't say it rings any bells. It was as though 2B's consciousness had been sent back from the present and overlaid over her past self. Impossible, yet here she was. 2B was used to certain things repeating themselves, but never this literally. I must be going insane, she thought. This is a hallucination brought on by failing logic circuits in a dying mind. It is the only way I can explain how I have returned here, how 9's could be alive, and how I could have possibly hugged him. But it felt far too real to be any sort of dream. Observation, Yoarha Unit 9's abandoned his position, Pod 153 interjected in its cool female voice, once your flight unit crashed. Perhaps he wished to guarantee your own safety foremost over engaging with the Goliath. Before continuing with the mission, 9's hastily added, of course. Statement, Yoarha Unit 9's has retreated from the battle against orders, and as such is now a deserter. Pod 042, 2B's own support pod, answered. Proposal, 9's should be prosecuted for dereliction of duty. The recommended sentence. Belay that thought, Pod 042. 2B held up her hand. If I am dreaming, I may as well make the most of it. Fantasy or not, she thought, this time I could make sure things end up differently. I want you to run a deep scan of my cognitive core for any abnormalities. 2B's words felt perfunctory even to her, as if she were sleepwalking through her previous steps, even though she was already going off script. A tall flower sprouted up from the ground between 2B's feet. It smiled at her. "Howdy," it chirped. "My name's Floey." "Floey the oh, shit, it's you again." Before 2B or Nines could react, Floey shot back underground. "Friend of yours, Tubes?" Nines asked, half bemused, half amused. So there was one entity that remembered as well as her. 2B shook her head. "Perhaps my reputation precedes me." Struck with an idea out of the blue, she walked over to 9SS flight unit and climbed into its cradle, letting the airship fold around her to embrace her body. "Hey 2B. What are you doing?" "What about me?" It was time to test just how impermeable that barrier protecting this underground kingdom really was. 2B took off. She flew into the spotlight, aligned her flight path with the hole in the ceiling, and let the outside world rush toward her. She wasn't the least bit surprised by it, but the last thing 2B heard was the sound of thick metal plating crumpling like aluminum foil. Commencing system check. Memory unit, green. Can you hear me? We want you to wake up. You have to stay determined. You can't give up. You are the future of humans and monsters. Please. Wake up. I don't like this plan anymore. No, I said. I said I'd never doubt you. 6, right? We just have to get 6. And we'll do it together, right? Initializing tactics log. Loading geographic data. Vitals, green. Remaining MP, 100%. The other soul. I think it's black box temperature, normal. Black box internal pressure, normal. Activating IFF. Activating FCS. Initializing pod connection. Unable to establish a connection to the bunker. Proposal, find a position free of signal interference. Launching DBU setup. Activating inertia control system. Activating environmental sensors. 2B, are you alright? 2B. Equipment status, green. All systems green. Combat preparations complete _. 2B squeezed herself free of the wreckage of her mangled flight unit, setting foot on the grassy, flower-dotted soil coating the ground. Much to her frustration, everything happened exactly as it had before, except that this time she didn't accidentally hug Nines and Floey laughed at her when he showed up. And then, just as 2B had expected, Toriel, the caretaker of the ruins, or, more accurately, Toriel, the former queen of the monstrous kingdom, made her appearance, stepping through the crumbling stone archway into the cavern. "Oh, I do hope that nasty flower has not been I thought I'd seen him creeping around here," she wondered aloud. For an instant, 2B wondered if Toriel had retained her memories as well. However, there was a genuine look of surprise on the woman's face as she noticed the two androids. She held out her hand. "Children, are you two lost? My name is Toriel, caretaker of the ruins." 2B shuddered as the knowledge that the monster woman she'd killed had come back without a trace of her memories, just like 9S, washed over her. Everything disappeared. She wasn't seeing the monster in front of her. Or rather, she was, but the world around Toriel had changed. She saw Toriel sitting beside a roaring hearth filled with flickering violet flames, younger with a warmer smile and a more vibrant look in her eyes. A little monster boy, her spitting image, sat on the floor at her side, cross-legged, looking up at 2B with an eager smile. "Do you like it?" the boy asked, staring expectantly. "Open it up. There's a surprise inside." 2B looked down and saw a golden heart-shaped locket lying in her outstretched hand, the light from the fire flowing and dancing over its polished surface. She thumbed the tab on the locket's side and popped it open. Inside the locket she could see the mechanisms of a tiny music box, a perforated cylinder and a metal comb whose teeth produced the ringing notes. There was a message etched into the inside of the locket's cover in a child's hasty scrawl. "Best friends forever." "I was expecting chocolate," she heard herself say in a voice that was not her own. The mother and child both laughed, and she laughed, too. The intrusive thought passed through 2B's mind like a burst of interference, for a split second numbing her limbs and blanking out her thoughts, and then she was back. From that moment on, things proceeded mostly the way they had the first time. Toriel welcomed 2B and Nines into her home, and with characteristic unprofessionalism, Nines took advantage of every unnecessary act of hospitality the old goat provided. As much as 2B liked to pretend his attitude was irksome, and sometimes she did not need to pretend, she always appreciated his presence. "I know you must feel conflicted," 2B told Nines as the two of them sat down at Toriel's table, "about abandoning our mission for my sake. But I believe you did the right thing in following me down here. If anybody wishes to accuse you of dereliction of duty when we return, I will personally vouch for you." The time wasn't yet right to tell him that this place was inescapable. 2B wasn't sure when she'd be ready to tell him. A relieved smile stretched across 9's face as he played with the wilted, brown flowers placed in the center of the table. "See, that's why I rescued you." 2B crossed her arms. "I would have done the same for you. Purely as a matter of professional courtesy, of course." "Oh, of course, yes." Nines accidentally snapped a withered blossom off its stem and hastily tried to reattach it. "That's why I did it, too. Are you feeling okay, 2B? I'd expected you to be a lot more injured after a crash like that." "I am unhurt," she said, but as the words left her lips a sharp, stabbing pain shot up her side from her hip to her shoulder, sharp enough to make her involuntarily wince. Strange. She hadn't been injured at all after the crash in the previous timelines. Had some of her wounds carried over from one timeline to another, the same way her consciousness and memories had? Nines stood up and helped 2B to her feet. "Come in, let me have a look." Toriel popped her head out of the kitchen. "Children, I hope you don't mind me asking where." "Your pie is about to burn, ma'am," 2B said. Toriel glanced back at the oven. "Goodness, my child, you are right," she cried out, rushing back into the kitchen. As Nines helped her over to Toriel's spare bedroom, 2B opened up a secure, nonverbal channel to her support pod. "Pod 042, while Nines is doing his maintenance checks, I want you to run a deep scan for any cognitive abnormalities." "Acknowledged," the pod replied, its smooth and soothing voice ringing in 2B's ears, inaudible to everyone but her. 2B woke up in darkness, although her eyes quickly adjusted to the gloom. She was still in the spare bedroom, the soft bedsheets underneath her like velvet compared to some of the surfaces she usually had to sleep on. As she sat up, she prodded her side where the pain had been. It was gone. Whatever had gone wrong, Nines must have repaired it. Nines was slumped over on a chair in the corner of the room, his satchel and a collection of tools and spare parts lying at his feet. Sitting among the tools was a small porcelain plate with a smattering of crumbs on it and a fork. 2B looked down and saw another little plate and fork on the floor beside the bed, this one with a sliver of pie sitting on it. When she'd closed her eyes, she'd half expected to wake up back in Ascary's throne room, the strange dream over and done. But she was still here, which meant it was all real. 2B opened up a secure channel to her support pod, speaking to it in a silent, telepathic whisper. "Pod 042. Have you completed your cognitive diagnostic?" "Affirmative." Statement: the diagnostic finished running its course exactly 1.215 hours ago. "Have you found anything?" The answer Pod 042 came back with shocked 2B. "Analysis, no abnormalities detected," it said. For a millisecond 2B struggled to regain her icy composure. Nothing? Then what had compromised her? Whose voices had been creeping into her audio processors? "Good," she said. "Thank you, Pod 042. 2B reached down and picked up the plate, resting it on her lap as she sat on the edge of the bed. She took a tentative stab at the slice of pie with her fork. The filling was firm, giving easily but still retaining some resistance, and the crust yielded much less readily. With some trepidation, she didn't make a habit of eating and wasn't sure what to expect. 2B slid the laden fork into her mouth. She scarcely had the words to describe it. Though it had long grown cold, the pie still tasted warm somehow. The filling had a sweet, buttery, almost creamy taste offset by a hot aromatic tinge from the cinnamon, and the crust was light, airy, and flaky. It was so sweet that 2B nearly gagged on it. Never in her life had she eaten something even half as good as this. Before she knew it, she'd cleaned her plate. 2B crept past Nines, letting the door swing open and soft incandescent light from the hallway peek into the room, and stepped into the living room. Toriel was sitting in a chair beside the hearth, just as in 2B's vision from earlier that day, and was absorbed in an old, thick book. Miss Toriel, was it? Toriel looked up at 2B, reflected light from the fire shimmering on her half-moon-shaped reading glasses. Yes, my child? What is it? There is more pie in the kitchen if you'd like another slice. Remembering the portrait from the castle, 2B added, or may I call you Queen Toriel? Toriel laughed it off. I beg your pardon? Does this humble little house look so much like a castle to you? She asked with a faint, yet nervous hint of a smile that let 2B know she'd struck a nerve. I know who you are. Toriel removed her reading glasses and set down her book. May I ask how? 2B froze. Of course, she couldn't explain that she had traveled through time. Your regal bearing is unmistakable, you carry yourself with the pride of authority, she answered, lying through her teeth. Furthermore, the clothes you are wearing, though faded, were once purple, a color associated all throughout human history with royalty due to the rarity of the dye. In addition, Toriel held up her paw. Enough. There is no hiding from you, I see. I do wonder how you can see through that blindfold. Quite easily, actually. Do you have a question for me? The Queen asked, her voice clipped and terse. It seemed she did not care much for talking about her past. 2B did but wasn't certain how to articulate it. What Ascari had said to her in the throne room still swirled around in her head, a cacophony of bittersweet grief and quiet anguish. 2B thought about Yoarha. She had served them with pride, yes, but one could not follow all of the orders one was given for so many years without beginning to resent the ones who gave those orders. Especially when one was forced to kill. And now she was outside their sphere of influence, in a subterranean realm where no one would ever find her or Nines, where the signals from her black box would never reach the bunker, where 2B and Nines could go for the rest of their lives without ever having to worry about the day she would inevitably have to. Did she dare defect from Yoarha, leave everybody she knew back above ground to struggle on their own against the horde of machines, all to keep herself and her partner safe from their bloody fate? Which option, leaving or staying, would she find harder to live with? Which choice would prove more loathsome? 2B struggled to condense the paradoxes raging in her mind into a single line of inquiry that could soothe her troubled mind. Why, she asked Toriel, did you run away? Toriel returned to her book. Humph. She tried to rephrase the question. Are you confident it was the right thing to do, Your Highness? Toriel pretended she hadn't heard 2B's question and kept reading. So 2B repeated it. I would rather you did not ask such impertinent questions, young lady, Toriel responded before she stood up, closed her book, and strode off to her own bedroom. Struck by embarrassment, 2B quickly added, and thank you for the pie, ma'am. It was very good. If Toriel had heard her, she made no indication that she had. 2B stood alone in front of the fireplace and watched the lavender flames inside flicker and die. There were no answers for her in this house. Having left early in the morning, before Toriel had woken up, 2B and Nines trudged through the thick snow. Just as before, Nines lagged behind a bit, awestruck at the environment, and this time around, 2B took it much more slowly as well. She walked just slowly enough for 9 seconds to slip in front of her, and when he did, she crouched down, buried her hands in the snow. It was lighter and fluffier than she'd expected and shaped a heaping handful of the stuff into a rough sphere. Her HUD began to flicker. 2B adjusted the visor covering her eyes and the flickering stopped. Shrugging it off as merely the result of the temperature differential between the ruins and the forest, 2B turned her attention back to the snowball. You think we'll find a way past that barrier out here, 2B? Nines asked, looking up at the cloudy sky that, despite its lack of sun, cast a just past sunrise glow through the heavy gray clouds. Yes. I am certain of it. 2B completed her snowball, hefting it in one hand. She threw it and nailed Nines in the back of the head. 2B almost found it amusing enough to smile, almost. Nines had been right. This was fun. Nines shuddered from the cold and looked over his shoulder, clearly shocked to see his partner crouched down in the middle of a snowbank. 2B, what are you doing? 2B stood up, brushing the snow off her gloves. Something humans used to do in the winter. They would make little balls of this stuff and throw them at each other. It was fun. Apparently. Huh. Yeah, I remember reading that somewhere. Nines laughed. So, who are you, and what have you done with the real 2B? I simply wanted to see things from your perspective. Ha. Nines scoffed as he brushed the snow off his hair. Give me some credit, 2B. As if I'd ever do something like that to you. With that out of her system, 2B caught up with Nines as he ambled his way down the ragged path through the alpine forest. She laid a hand on his shoulder. 9S. What is it, 2B? Something wrong. We're cut off from the bunker, she reminded him. That means we can't upload any new backup data. If either of us dies in here, we won't come back. If Nines pondered her advice. I knew that. Granted, it hasn't been that dangerous so far, but don't do anything reckless, Nines. Stay safe. Nines reached up and lifted her hand off his shoulder, giving it a sympathetic squeeze as he laughed a little awkwardly, evidently not sure where his partner's sudden burst of sentimentality had come from. You, too, 2B. I mean, you're the one who. You are far less cautious than you should be, 2B said, taking the lead as she trudged down the path through the forest. Too eager to endanger yourself. Scanners aren't built for combat the same way Type B androids are. Please keep that in mind. 2B brushed away a spiny tree branch in her way and trudged onward, the snow crunching beneath her boots, but realized far too late as she put her foot down that there was no longer any solid ground beneath it. She'd failed to recognize the familiar scenery around her and had stepped into the same sinkhole Nines had found himself stuck in before time had rewound itself. The snow was soft against her exposed skin but cold enough that it nearly stung as 2B reached up and scrabbled at the frozen ground. Nines and his support pod grabbed her by the arm and started pulling, while Pod 042 took hold of her other arm. Hey, there. Looks like you could use a hand, pal. And right on cue, there was Sans, the sanctimonious little prick. We are fine, 2B called out to him, very much not willing to involve herself in the skeleton's insufferable routine yet again. Pay him no mind, she told Nines. Nines slipped a bit against the icy ground beneath the snow drifts, though, and gladly took Sans' hand for support. The hand came loose, of course, and in his shock Nines lost his footing and tumbled headfirst into the sinkhole, his legs protruding from the churned-up snow like trees. Whoops. That wasn't supposed to happen. Sans shoved his remaining hand and severed wrist into his jacket pockets. He started to whistle, gingerly sidestepping the hole in the ground as he walked away. After about a minute of embarrassed flailing, the androids and their support pods managed to pull themselves free. That's it, said Nines as he sat down, pulled off one of his boots, and shook the snow out of it. I'm sick of this stuff. I suppose snow angels are out of the question, then, 2B replied as she brushed snow, white on silvery white, out of his hair. Yeah, I would. I overheard you talking to 210 about them, 2B lied. Nines blushed. Eavesdropping, throwing snowballs, am I rubbing off on you, 2B? 2B would have answered, but another anomaly appeared on her HUD, a brief error message that flashed by too quickly for 2B to make it out. 2B frowned. Pod 042, repeat the latest contents of my error log. The pod took a few seconds to process 2B's command. Statement, no new errors logged since the crash. Is something wrong? Nines asked as he pulled his boots back on. It was nothing, 2B replied, shaking her head. False positive. After all, if there really had been something wrong, Nines would have already caught it during his maintenance. Much to 9S's surprise, when the two androids encountered the Great Papyrus, 2B decided to embrace his challenges, even if it meant having to suffer through more of Sans and his terrible sense of humor. She was doing it more for 9 seconds than for any other reason, although, of course, she'd never let him know it. The traps, japs, and puzzles Papyrus had promised were not at all what either android had expected. Sitting on a lone snow-dusted table standing in the woods was a frosted plate of frozen spaghetti. Papyrus was nowhere to be seen. 2B broke off a small chunk of pasta and placed it inside her mouth. Nines cringed. 2B? What are you? She ate it. Nines picked up the sheaf of paper lying on the table next to the frost-coated plate. "Hello, human. This is my most ingenious trap yet," he read aloud. "2B, spit that out. It could be poison." He knocked the plate on the ground and stomped on it for good measure. Androids did not eat for sustenance, but occasionally did so for pleasure. Unlike some of her peers, 2B had little experience with food. However, she did not need to know what spaghetti normally tasted like to recognize that the hard shard of noodles and tomato sauce was an utterly vile affront to the senses. Especially compared to the heavenly slice of pie from last night. 2B did not need to be told to eject the so-called meal, she did so completely willingly and with gusto. Nines read on. "The human will eat this gourmet dinner and will be so enthralled by its delicious cromulence." He paused. "Not a real word," he commented. "They will waste their time eating it while I set up a truly inescapable trap." The great papyrus japs once again. He let the paper fall to the ground, disappointed. "This guy's not playing with a full deck. Anyway, how's it taste?" 2B grabbed a handful of snow and shoved it into her mouth. The taste still lingered. "I'd rather it had been poison." The two of them trudged onward to Papyrus' next trap. Across a barren field, the skeleton stood tall, his gloved hands on his hips, his crimson scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Well," he called out with his booming, nasally voice. "How was the spaghetti? Did it delight the senses? Did it tickle your taste buds? Did it embiggen your spirits with its sheer culinary?" "It was the most awful thing I have ever eaten," said 2B. Papyrus' bony face fell. Really?" Sans reached up to pat his brother on the shoulder. "Don't let it get to you, bro. These humans wouldn't know culinary excellence if it hit them in the face." "Yes, of course." Papyrus pounded a fist into his hand. "I feel sorry for you, pitiful humans." Sans shook his head. "I hear they don't even make their food with magic." "You don't even," Papyrus let out an exaggerated sigh. "I truly weep for you. You poor people simply cannot understand true culinary artistry." Papyrus stroked his chin. "Although you do have quite good fashion senses. Anyway. Behold my next puzzle." He flung out his arms. "Fiendish in its execution, try it if you dare." The field of snow was still empty. Nines stepped forward, but 2B threw her arm out in front of his chest. What could be under the snow? Landmines? Electrified panels? Sharpened sticks? Papyrus sighed. "Sans, give them the puzzle." Sans rolled his eyes, somehow, walked across the field, picked up 2 pieces of paper, and handed them both to the 2 androids. "Hey," he whispered, "I know it might not seem like much, but my brother really tries, okay? Pretend you're struggling with this one and I'll buy you guys burgers or something." With that, he returned to his brother's side, crossing his arms in tandem with Papyrus. The last thing 2B wanted was a burger from Sans. Nevertheless, she looked down at the damp sheet of paper in her hands. The ink had started to run, but it was clearly a crossword puzzle. She glanced at 9's sheet. His was unmistakably a word search puzzle. "Dumbfounded, are you?" "Dumbfounded by my staggering intellect," Papyrus crowed. Speechless in the presence of the greatest mind, the Papyrus. Nines called out, holding out the word search and shaking it. "Is this really the puzzle?" Papyrus gasped and held a hand to his gaping mouth. Oh no, how could I not see it?" He rushed over and tore the pages from the android's hands. "This puzzle isn't fair at all. I am so sorry I didn't notice your disabilities." "Excuse me?" 2B asked. "Those strips of cloth over your eyes, why, you two are blind. Blind as bats. And here I am giving you puzzles that rely exclusively on sight." Papyrus flung his hand to his forehead. "No, do not feel hurt or belittled. The shame is mine and mine alone, poor humans, that I, the great Papyrus, was so insensitive and unobservant. We don't wear these things because we can't see," said Nines, trying to reassure the poor skeleton. "Our eyes work fine. If anything." Papyrus dropped to his knees. "Oh, how foolish of me. Your religious practices must forbid you the use of your eyes. 1,000 pardons for my religious and cultural insensitivity." He sniffled. I always try to make my Japs, puzzles, and traps as inclusive and welcoming as possible, but. Nines patted him on the shoulder. No, these are our visors. They help us see. Oh. Papyrus leaped to his feet. Oh. He shoved the pages back into Nines and 2B's hands. Please continue, then. And with a nasally laugh he rakishly flung his scarf over his shoulder and strode over to the other side of the field. Nines looked over to 2B and shrugged, then studied his own puzzle. Well, that was easy, he said after a few seconds. How about you, 2B? 2B peered at the sheet of paper in her own hands, but every word and shape on the page she tried to focus on seemed to slide away from her gaze. She blinked a few times, trying to resolve the letters, but the world only seemed to grow fuzzier. 2B, are you all right? Her legs felt weak like they'd felt in the throne room before she'd traveled back to the past, and with nothing to hold her up 2B crumpled to the ground. 2B. Nines knelt at her side, grabbing her by the shoulders. His voice sounded further away with every passing second. 2B, what's wrong? You bastards, what did you do to her? 2B reached out and grabbed at 9S's collar with fumbling, numbing fingers. Error messages and warning lights flashed across her HUD faster than she could read them. 9S, she choked out, it's not them, it's... Everything went black. Toriel woke up that morning to find the room she had offered to her newest guests empty save for a loose sheet of paper lying on the bed. And on that paper in strong, impossibly neat handwriting was written. HRH Toriel. Thank you for your hospitality. It is unfortunate that we could not stay longer. I, however, have questions to which I must have answers. It would be nice if our paths crossed again soon. Your presence was somewhat... A word was scratched out, a word that looked like it started with a C and ended with ing. Appreciated. Yoarha number 2 Type B. Chapter 6, Be Possessed by Disease. Nines felt the tips of 2B's fingers scratch against his collarbone as she collapsed. He stood over her body with his sword in hand, grasping its hilt with a white-knuckle grip in the hopes that his hands would stop trembling. The skeletons rushed forward. Stay back. Nines snarled, adrenaline coursing through his system. One more step and I'll cut you to pieces. They took a step backward. The shorter one held up his hands. Whoa, hey, kid, I think your friend needs help. I said, stay back. Nines kept his sword held out in front of him as he knelt beside 2B and placed 2 fingers from his free hand over her neck, constantly glancing from her over to the skeletons and back. As his fingers brushed against her bare skin he jerked them away. 2B's skin was hot to the touch. Even the snow around her was starting to melt. Her breath came out in shallow, feverish gasps. What the hell would produce these symptoms? A logic virus? How could I not have noticed earlier? Nines racked his brain for an answer as he dug through his satchel for a syringe of a vaccine. Once he had the syringe in his hand he steadied his aim and drove the needle into 2B's neck, depressing the plunger until every drop of vaccine had entered her circulatory system. Nothing changed. 2B's temperature kept rising. Pod 042, he growled, acutely aware of the blood singing in his ears. What the hell is going on here? Commencing system check. Memory unit, green. Initializing tactics log. Loading geographic data. Vitals, yellow. Hey, Chara. Smile for the camera. Oh, whoops, it looks like I left the lens cap on. Ha. I did it on purpose that time. Now you're smiling for no reason. Remaining MP, 32%. Black box temperature, high. Black box internal pressure, normal. 2B, it's me, Nines. Can you hear me? Activating IFF. Activating FCS. Failed. Initializing pod connection. Failed. Unable to establish a stable connection to Yoarha Unit 2B. Running diagnostic. Launching DBU setup. Activating inertia control system. Activating environmental sensors. 2B, please wake up. Equipment status, red. Boot process aborted. Running disk integrity check. Damn it, don't make me do this. Override password. Forced safe boot engaged. Yo Arha number 2 type B safe mode online _ 2B woke up, and her sight returned to her soon afterward. The resolution was low, the display monochrome, but she could make out Nines standing at her side pixelated and blurry as his image was. She couldn't pull up her HUD. She couldn't move, either not to lift a finger, nor even to open her mouth and speak. This was safe mode, almost every process in her body was disabled by default. Nines sighed in relief. Oh, thank God. It's not a virus. She was lying on something hard, but not metal or plastic. Wood. Not a cot or an operating table. Behind Nines was what could have been a sink loaded with dirty dishes. A kitchen? Was she in a kitchen? Why was she in a kitchen? Don't be afraid, 2B. Nines patted her on the forehead. His hand was frigid. I've got you stabilized. I'm re-enabling some of your drivers now. 2B winced and blinked away reflexive tears as her vision sharpened. Color returned to the world. Her HUD was still gone, though 9S must have removed her visor. She noticed that 9S's cheeks were flushed with exertion, and both Pod 042 and 153 were hovering at his side. Nod your head if you can. 2B did so. Emboldened, she tried to sit up, but Nines held her down. Her head throbbed. The normal resonant thrumming of her black box had pitched up to a quiet, buzzing whine. Don't overexert yourself, Nines cautioned her. We haven't figured out what's wrong yet. Can you speak? No, she said, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling. Her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. I don't think I can, 9S. Nines couldn't help but grin just a little. Okay, either you're really about to die, or I forgot to re-enable your humor inhibitors. His gentle ribbing put 2B's mind at ease. She turned her head and glanced around the room. It was definitely a kitchen. Who's we? And why are we in a kitchen? God help. Analysis complete, Pod 042 announced as it hovered at 2B's side. Statement, forced shutdown occurred due to a fault in Unit 2B's cooling system that allowed the black box to reach an unacceptable temperature range. Normal unit reactivation is prohibited until the damaged component is restored. Further information transferred to Pod 153. Pod 153 chimed in. Statement, a valve in coolant transfer subsystem Row 3476 has become misaligned, preventing the free and even flow of coolant throughout the body. Nines slumped over. Oh, God, 2B, I'm sorry 153, can we realign the valve? Negative. The component has degraded to the point at which replacement is the only option. Crestfallen, Nines put a hand to his forehead. Damn it, he muttered. This is all my fault, 2B. I must have accidentally damaged you while I was doing your maintenance last night. His fist pounded against the table. D-damn. That was possible, but 2B wasn't so sure any clumsiness of 9S's part was the culprit. This wasn't the first unexplainable injury she'd had since time had last reset. Sans popped up next to Nines, appearing so suddenly it was as if he'd teleported into existence, as he was wont to do. Hey, Doc. How's the patient? Oh, great. Sans was here. Her core's overheating. Nines took 2B's hand, and it was then that she realized that it wasn't that his hands were ice cold, as much as it felt that way to her. She really was burning up, and from her perspective everything else was icy. Fever, eh? Sans tapped his foot. So, what, fluids, bed rest, that sort of stuff. Papyrus, he called out. What's that soup you made back when Undine got the flu? None of that will help, 2B responded, not in the least bit enthusiastic to try more of Papyrus' culinary masterpieces. A failed component of my cooling system needs replacement. Oh. Sans cringed. And I guess you can't just pop over to the auto shop and get a new one. But here's a thought, the royal scientist has a lab over in Hotland. She does tons of work in robotics. Nines scoffed at the suggestion. We androids are a little more advanced than Mir. Sans stuck his hands in his jacket pockets. Trust me, Dr. Alphys could whip up 100 of whatever you need in 5 minutes. She's super hard to get a hold of, though, you'd have to visit her in person. Hotland. It didn't take a staggering intellect to tell which segment of this underground kingdom that name referred to. And if Nines had to go there, then he'd have to pass through the watery tunnels, where he'd run into. Papyrus barged into the kitchen. "Everybody out," he screeched. Patient on the couch. "I am going to make the finest, most delicious fever remedy the world has ever seen. The world will know my skills not only as a chef and a hunter of humans but as a great physician as well." "All right, then, Sans." Nines gestured to pod 153. "If I had 153 bring schematics for the valve we need with you, could you run over to her lab and have her construct this for us?" Sans shrugged. "Okay, do you really trust me to ask her to build the right thing?" "Papyrus, what happened when you had me get you half a pound of biscuits?" "Dinner was ruined. It was supposed to be biscuits with gravy, not brisket with gravy. Also, Dr. Alphys kinda refuses to speak to me. And I've got an appointment later today." Sans leaned in between the two androids. "Besides," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "someone's gotta stay behind and keep Papyrus from feeding 2B his candy and cough syrup soup." 9S's face turned ashen. "Fine. I'll go find her." "Wait, 9S. 2B tried and failed once again to sit up. The frustration of being resigned to this table and in the same house as Sans, as if being injured wasn't bad enough, hurt worse than the splitting headache she was currently enduring. If Nines ran into Undine on his own, he'd be helpless, but how could she tell him that? With the static running through her brain, she doubted she could think clearly enough to explain convincingly that she'd traveled through time. "Be careful. Do not meander." Nines saluted. "I won't waste any time, ma'am." "Actually, take as much time as you need." Sans patted Nines on the back. "She's patient." A hush settled over the kitchen. "He's cook," Sans added, pointing at Papyrus. And then, pointing at Nines, he added, after a pregnant pause to let everybody anticipate what he was going to say, "He's android." Papyrus audibly ground his teeth as he tended to his veritable witch's brew, and 2B felt a strong sense of empathy toward him. "Please, hurry," 2B thought as she let her heavy eyes fall shut. Sleep was a welcome respite. The last thing she needed now was to be subjected to all this any longer than necessary. The instructions from Sans had been simple. Take the road from Snowdon to Waterfall, stay on the path, take a right at Gerson's shop, and when you reach the Echo Garden, keep going straight into Hotland until you see a big, white building. Sounded simple enough. As Nines hurried along, his own guilt over 2B's condition gnawed away at him, irrational as it was. The maintenance work he'd done the night before hadn't even come close to the now damaged coolant subsystem in question, but he couldn't help but feel that his fingers must have slipped and had some effect somewhere down the line. Nines couldn't help but recall his first words to 2B. "The commander's put me in charge of your maintenance, ma'am. That means I'll be performing regular checks on you from now on." That was his job, just like how 2B's job was killing machines. And unlike 2B, evidently, he wasn't much good at it. The silence bothered him almost as much as the guilt. No chatter from the bunker, no targets constantly being updated on his HUD, no 21-0 to hand down new objectives from command, and consequently a lot less talk from pod 153. And of course, no 2B to chat with. If he strained his ears he could almost hear indistinct radio chatter, but it must have been his imagination, a sort of phantom pain, as if getting cut off from the bunker was like a part of himself had been amputated. No, it wasn't just silence, it was listlessness. No missions. Nothing telling Nines what to do but his own conscience. It was funny that despite how often he chafed under strict leadership, down here he almost missed it. As the gloomy tunnel walls of Waterfall passed him by, Nines caught a flash of red light out of the corner of his eye from one of the many tributary tunnels snaking away from the slightly paved main path through the area. His heavy footfalls slapping against the thin pools of water littering the path ceased as he came to a stop and looked around, his own breathing loud in his ears. There was the red light again, off in the dark distance. Even so far away from it, Nines could tell at the second glance that it was none other than the glare of a machine lifeform's optical sensor. His hand flew to his sword's hilt. Of course, he thought. If 2B and I could get lost down here, who's to say a few machines couldn't get stuck in this place as well? Nines tapped on his pod's hull with his free hand. Pod 153, scan for machine life forms. A second later, the sparsely detailed map in the corner of his HUD lit up with a cluster of black arrowhead icons. Machines. And not too far off, too. Do I deal with these things now, he asked himself, or keep going? 2B had urged him to hurry, but any machine left alive could hurt somebody. On the other hand, who knew how long 2B's condition would stay stable? Pod 042 could only do so much on its own, and with those two skeletons helping, nice as they were, who knew how bad things could get? No, he and 2B could take care of it once she was hale and hearty again. Machines could wait. A plaintive cry cut through the humid, dank air. Help! Help! The shouts rang out in a child's squeaky, high-pitched voice. Nines sighed, assured himself it would only be a slight detour, and ran toward the voice toward the cluster of hostiles. Deep in one of the winding tunnels, a rough semicircle of machines surrounded a diminutive lizardish creature. The creature, a child, had a head full of stubby spikes, wide eyes full of mortal terror, and no arms with which to defend themselves. The machine life forms were short, about as short as their prey, as a matter of fact, rusty models, the kind Nines had dealt with 100 times already on the surface. They had little spherical heads that were almost cute, set into bullet-shaped bodies. These models were nicknamed Short Stubbies by the androids fighting on the front lines because they were, well, short and stubby. The monster child beset by the stubbies let out another frightened wail as they backed up against the smooth, slick wall of the cave. The machines drew closer. Galvanized into action, Nines charged the machines, cutting through their rusty, moss-covered hulls with ease. The survivors of 9SS initial attack windmilled their spindly little arms in panic and began to disperse. Not so fast. Nines flung out his hand at one of the fleeing robots, his line-of-sight hacking protocols kicking into high gear. Within a second of locking onto the lead machine, Nines was in. Hacking was an experience he'd sorely missed. The adrenaline rush, the euphoria you felt when you were swept up into the mind of another computer, be it a terminal, a server, a machine life form, or even a fellow android, just couldn't compare to anything else. Nines could best liken it to the adrenaline rush 2B spoke about feeling in combat. You could feel your body falling away as your mind, sharp as a knife, projected itself through your enemy's defenses, and it was the most wonderful feeling in the world. Stubbies had little defenses against hacking, and once Nines had pierced the lead machine's brain, it only took a few milliseconds for him to tear through the meager barriers in place and replace what passed for a mind in this unfeeling hunk of metal with junk data. 9SS consciousness slipped back into his body just as the hacked robot's body erupted into a blossom of flames, taking out all of its friends along with it. Satisfied, he wiped the oil staining his blade off on his sleeve and sheathed the sword on his back. "It's okay now," he told the monster kid, offering them his hand before realizing that the kid didn't have any arms. "Those guys can't hurt you anymore." The child looked up at Nines with big, round eyes and took a hesitant step backward. Nines noticed the kid's face was bruised and a little swollen. "Th, that. It's all right. You're safe now." "Yo, that was so cool." The kid looked up at him, their wide eyes filled with awe. "You just jumped in and chopped them up and then you pointed at that one and exploded it with your mind." Nines wasn't sure how to react to this child's fawning adoration. Yeah, well, I'm a Type S, it's as natural as breathing, really." "Dude, do you know Undyne?" "You gotta if you're so strong." The kid ran circles around him. "Can you take me to see her? I was out looking for her when I..." The kid's breathless exclamations were halted when they tripped over their own feet, plowing their face into the ground. Nines winced in sympathy and knelt down to help the little guy up, but the kid just bounced right back up, their smile suggesting they were no worse for the wear even as their fresh black eye suggested otherwise. "Well, mister," the kid asked. "What about it?" "Who's Undyne?" Nines asked. The kid gasped. "Dude, you gotta be living under a rock or something. Undyne's only the biggest, baddest, toughest, most heroic monster in the whole kingdom. She never backs down and she never gives up, and even if you killed her she wouldn't die because..." "Oh. Yeah. That Undyne. Anyway, kid, do you need any help getting home?" "Focus, Nines," he chastised himself as the words left his mouth. You can't afford to get derailed anymore. Nah, I know this place like the tip of my tail. Thanks, mister. The kid ran off, tripped and fell again, and kept going. Nines sighed and consulted his map, eager to get back on track, and noticed more life signs. And the clumsy kid was headed right for them. Wait, he shouted out, hurrying back. Kid. Damn it, he thought, I can't turn my back on a kid who thinks I'm cool. In the darkness up ahead, Nines spotted the half-hidden silhouette of a Goliath Bipt, a much taller machine than its stubby cohorts with strong, thick hammer arms, scarcely able to move through the cavern up ahead without crouching, but still dangerous. Nines drew his sword. Pod 153, light him up. On his command, a hail of gunfire drove the machine back, rattling its metal body and casting flickering yellow-orange light throughout the tunnel. Nines ran ahead as bullets flew overhead, swept up the monster kid in the crook of his arm, and held out the flat of his sword against the flat of his palm just in time to parry the Bipt's mighty piston-propelled fist. Leave the kid alone, damn it. The little pinprick eyes in the machine's disproportionately tiny spherical head blinked almost curiously as Nines staggered backward under the force of the blow. Nines ground his teeth as his boots slipped on the slick and mossy rocks, trying desperately to keep his traction on the ground. He wasn't a fighter like 2B and lacked her raw strength, but he had to try. As the Bipt drew back its fist for another punch, a cluster of aquamarine lights appeared below the machine's feet. A hum filled the air, and Nines felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as lances of energy like hardened lightning stabbed out from each tiny pool of light, skewering the machine. Arcs of electricity coursed over the Bipt's oversized body, and Nines leaped back as he felt a few of those arcs wisp their way off the machine and land on him. The interference momentarily grayed out his vision and sent squeals of white noise through his ears. The spears vanished in a cloud of sparks, leaving the battered machine in ruins. It slumped over and fell to pieces, its insides blackened and smoking, as a figure clad in thick, spiny knight's armor stepped out from behind a column created from a conjoined stalactite/stalagmite and walked over the wreckage. Twisted metal crunched beneath metal boots. The knight's helmet resembled the needle-toothed maw of some horrific sea creature from the pitch-black depths of the ocean, a single pinprick of light glinting in its right eye hole. The monster kid wriggled out of 9's grasp and ran over to the knight's side. Yo, Undyne. Nines took another step forward, still wielding his sword. His HUD still showed a few black icons, and they were converging on this spot. Kid. Undyne conjured a lightning spear and waved it in his direction, stopping Nines in his tracks. Get your hands away from them, human, she growled. The monster kid squinted at Nines. You're a human. Nines sheathed his weapon and held out his hands, palm up. Hold on. You're Undyne, right? Captain Undyne. Yeah, Captain Undyne. Listen up. I don't want any trouble. I've got to get to Hotland for a friend. It's urgent, she's. Shut up. Undyne took a step closer, still brandishing her spear. Do you know what you assholes did to us? Why the hell should I care about you and your friend? Nines glanced at his map again. The machines were coming closer. Listen up. I'm not human. I'm an android. Yoarha model number 9, type S. So there. Yeah, whatever, you look pretty human to me, said Undyne. Yeah, the kid cheered. You tell em, Undyne. What happened to me being the coolest thing you've ever seen, kid? Nines thought. Anyway, more of those machines are on their way here, and I don't have time to fight them, so, The red lights of machine lifeform optical sensors blazed to life around Undyne as a gaggle of smaller Bipts, about human size, and lacking the Goliath's piston-powered forearms, rushed to avenge their leader, all carrying rusty swords and spears pieced together from scrap. Nines booked it. See ya. Bye. Oh, no, you don't. Nines stopped in his tracks, his boots glued to the ground. An emerald green aura wrapped itself around his body, immobilizing his legs and pinning him in place. What was worse, the machines had him pegged as an android and were closing in on him. Pod 153 started picking them off, but machine life forms, like androids, could be surprisingly resilient. Nines twisted around, threw out his arm, and tried to get a line-of-sight bead on one of the Bipts as it closed in on him. The machine came closer, closer, raising its spear to run Nines through. Nines hacked it. But this time, instead of scrambling its brain and blowing it up, Nines took control. Partitioning your consciousness between two bodies wasn't an easy or pleasant experience. Seeing through two sets of eyes and moving two sets of limbs and having to distinguish between the two was taxing on the mind, to say the least. But at least now he, or rather his new puppet, could move freely. Nines used the machine puppet to pierce its companion's carapaces, allowing Pod 153 to fire on their sensitive innards, dispatching them far more quickly. The number of active machines quickly began to dwindle between 9SS puppet and Undyne's electrically charged spears. 9SS controlled Bip through its jerry-rigged junk spear, the aerodynamically dubious hunk of metal whistling over Undyne's shoulder and impaling a machine that had gotten behind her through its eye. The machine stumbled, its arms flailing as its single remaining optical sensor flickered and winked out before it slumped against a stalagmite. Then Nines had his machine puppet sock Undyne in the gut for good measure. She doubled over as the machine turned around and ran toward Nines, and Nines, gritting his teeth in exertion as he tried to make sure he knew exactly whose limbs he was moving, swung his sword and severed the machine lifeform's head from its shoulders. With a sharp, stabbing pain like an icicle through his brain, 9SS consciousness was shoved back into his own body. His legs abruptly freed from the green aura that had bound them, Nines slipped and fell. Undyne stood up, surveyed the area for any more machines, Nines checked his HUD, there weren't any, and grabbed the monster kid by the scruff of their neck. As she lifted them into the air, they kicked their feet a little before going limp. "What do I always say," she said, "about tin cans? If you see them, you turn around and run all the way back home," the kid droned, the words coming out as if they'd memorized them by rote. "But Undyne, I was going right home, but they sneaked up. You're not gonna tell my parents, are you?" Nines sat up, rubbing his aching tailbone. "Hey, lay off the kid," he said. "They just got a little turned around." "Shut up, human," said Undyne. Why yeah, shut up, human," the kid chimed in as Undyne set them down, patted them on the back, and not so gently nudged them away. The kid ran past Nines, paused, looked back, and whispered to him, "I know you're a human and we're kinda supposed to be enemies, but thanks for saving me back there. You're really cool." Then the kid ran off, tripped, picked themselves up, and kept running. So, Undyne stepped toward Nines. Not just a human, but a coward, too. Nines picked himself up off the ground. Brackish water dripped off his shorts and the hem of his coat. "Wrong on both counts. How many times do I have to say it? I'm an Andr." Undyne stomped on the ground and a spear shot up behind Nines, the arrowhead tip catching on the satchel slung over his back and his collar and lifting him off his feet. Spare parts, tools, and medical supplies poured out of the satchel and littered the ground beneath his feet. The electrical radiance from the solidified lightning at his back crackled along his spine and made his fingers and toes go numb. "So, he said, how long have you had a tin can problem here in your kingdom?" "First confirmed sighting was about 100 years ago or so. We think they live in the deepest parts of Waterfall, the parts no one lives in. Mostly they keep to themselves, but recently Undyne did a double take." "Hey. Why am I telling all this to you?" "I'm a soldier from the surface," Nines explained. "We're fighting a war against those things. If you let me go right now, I'll..." Undyne threw back her head and laughed, her muffled voice echoing inside her helmet. "You? A soldier? I'm more on the reconnaissance side of things, scanning, scouting, intelligence gathering." Nines talked a mile a minute, unsure of when Undyne was going to cut him off next. "My partner's a battle type, and I need to get to Dr. Alphys for the parts I need to." "Kiddo." Undyne lifted up her spiny knight's helmet, revealing an angular head covered in blue scales, red fins protruding from the sides. A long plume of crimson hair tied back in a ponytail slipped out of her helmet as she lifted it over her head. One eye was yellow, the other was covered by a ragged black eye patch. Old scars, pinkish against cerulean scales, crossed under the patch. "I don't give a shit. We only need 7 human souls to break the barrier and free our people, and we've got S." Undyne slapped herself in the forehead. "Ugh. There I go again. Why am I telling you all this? If you get in my way I swear I'll Nines racked his brain for something he could throw out there to use as leverage. If you let me go, I can repair my friend, and then the two of us can help you with your, infestation. No dice. Do you know Papyrus? Undine's eye lit up, but she extinguished it with a scowl that showed off her misshapen, yellowed fangs. What did you do to him? Nothing. Nothing. Nines held out his hands. We're, kind of friends. Give him a call. He'll vouch for me. Undine glared at him with a skeptical eye. All right. She unclasped her breastplate, pulled it off, reached into her armor, and pulled out a little clamshell phone, raising it to her earphone. Hey, Papyrus? Yeah, it's me, Undine. I've got a human here. Android Nines insisted. Hurry up. Who says he's your buddy? You know anything about this? Well, I gotta say, I'm really disappointed in you. You should know better than to fall for that stuff. I mean, androids? Really? Welp. Sure doesn't sound like things are going my way, Nines thought. No, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. No, Papyrus, I'm not putting this on your record. No, this isn't gonna affect your chances of getting into the Royal Guard yet. Sure, we're still on for pasta. I love your spaghetti. Nines sighed, tried to will feeling back into his extremities, and locked onto Undine's phone. With the incessant buzzing from electrical interference sending waves of fuzz up his neck and through his head, it was hard to focus, but how difficult could it be to hack into a primitive little cellular telephone? Got it. A sharp, ear-piercing squeal tore itself from the phone's tiny speaker, sending Undine reeling. The screech made Nines's ears ring from nearly a meter away. He shuddered to think of how much permanent hearing loss it might have caused Undine. As Undine toppled over, the dead phone flying from her gauntleted hand, the spear she'd conjured vanished. Free at last, Nines hit the ground and booked it. Hey! Get back here, damn it! Undine howled as she gave chase. Nines doubled over, resting his hands on his knees as the sweat pouring from his brow plastered his visor to his skin. He wiped his forehead on his sleeve, but to no avail. The air outside of Waterfall was blistering hot and dry. Each breath he took felt like he was swallowing a mouthful of sand. This, obviously, was Hotland, which meant he was almost to his destination. Catching his breath, he stumbled along the bridge, crossing the magma-filled ravine ahead of him. Off in the distance was the white building Papyrus had told him to look for. The bridge creaked and swayed ominously, and Nines was thankful when he again set foot on solid ground. He fumbled with the canteen hanging from his belt. As an android, he didn't need water just as he didn't need food, but a swig of water was just what he needed to at least temporarily wash the desert out of his mouth. After swishing it around in his mouth, he spat out the mouthful of water. As it hit the cracked and rocky ground, the water sizzled and instantly evaporated. Undine burst out of the tiny tunnel leading back to Waterfall. I said, stop running, she bellowed as she reached the bridge. She slowed down with every step she took until she was barely even walking. Sweat glistened against her blue scales and runny mascara ran from her eye down her cheek as she gasped for air. I said. Geez. How can you run so much, with such skinny little legs? Undine panted. Her ear fins drooped as she pulled herself along the bridge, slower and slower. When she at last set foot once more on solid ground, she fell flat on her face. Nines looked at Undine, then at Alfie's lab, then to his canteen. Oh, what the hell, he thought, it's not like I need it. He walked over to Undine, turned her onto her back so the hot rocks wouldn't burn her skin, and slipped the canteen into her hand. Here. Take the whole thing. It's on the house. Undine looked up at him with an angry yellow eye and let out a wordless croak. Nines pulled up his visor. But I swear, he growled, matching the glare in her eye with a glare in his own, if I can't get back to 2B in time because of you, I'll come back. And I'll kill you. Incoming transmission from Support Pod 153 to Support Pod 042. Connection accepted. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Query, do you have an update on Unit 2B's condition? Pod 042 to Pod 153. Affirmative. Statement, Unit 2B is still in danger of overheating, but has thus far avoided slipping into the red by avoiding physical exertion and conscious logical thought, and her condition will be stable indefinitely. In other words, she is sleeping. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Response: thank you. This unit will inform Unit 9s. The news will come as a relief to him. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Statement: there is something else this support unit wishes to discuss. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Response: elaborate. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Statement: since 2B's flight unit crashed, this support unit has observed several incidents of strange behavior on her part. On multiple occasions she has requested this unit recount apparent messages not recorded within her error log. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Query: has she requested an analysis of her cognitive functions? Statement: ancient human records speak of a mental disorder known as Munchausen syndrome, in which severe emotional difficulties lead to the subject repeatedly and deliberately acting as if sick or injured, sometimes without consciously realizing they are fabricating their ailments. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Statement: this unit has indeed performed a thorough analysis of Unit 2B's psyche, with no abnormalities detected and no trace of a logic virus infection. There is no damage to her visor to account for problems with her HUD, either. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Statement: that is indeed curious. Query: have you detected any abnormalities within 2B's visual or touch processors that may have led her to perceive injuries or error messages where none existed? Pod 042 to Pod 153. Statement: this unit has not observed any such errors. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Query: this does not include the current issue with 2B's coolant circulation, does it? Pod 042 to Pod 153. Response: it does not. Pod 153. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Statement: it seems you are claiming both that 2B is experiencing phantom illnesses and that there is nothing within 2B's psyche that would cause her to do so. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Response: it would seem that is the case. Statement: this support unit has a theory to resolve this apparent contradiction. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Response: elaborate. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Statement: additional intelligence gathering is required. However, it is possible, albeit unlikely, that a third party is falsifying the information passed between this support unit and 2B. Chapter 7, B Memory Leak. Toriel sat at the door leading out of the ruins, still holding onto 2B's letter, when she heard a knock at the heavy stone door. She had barely heard the first few knocks, lost in her own mind as she was. She'd been pondering the questions that girl had asked her last night, the questions that she had been too afraid, or was she too ashamed, to dignify with a response. Why did you run away? Was it the right thing to do? Knock knock. Toriel had a friend whom she met every week to trade jokes the two of them had workshopped. She'd clearly remembered he would arrive today, but when the time came when he actually showed up, it caught her by surprise nonetheless. My friend, Toriel called out, I am afraid I am not in the mood today. That's okay, lady. I'm not really in the mood either. Toriel couldn't help but let out a little self-effacing laugh. Did we both come here, my friend, to tell each other we did not wish to be here? The man on the other side of the door laughed. Sure looks like it. But really, remember the promise you had me make. It had been years ago. After the last visitors had passed through her home, after she'd risked leaving her house and trekking to Snowdon and had seen the face of her last guest on the front page of the newspaper to join the 5 other visitors from the surface Askari had murdered. Whatever it takes, she'd blubbered to her anonymous friend through a veil of tears, the next time a human comes out this door, please try to look after them. Toriel felt that ever-present ache in her heart throb anew. Oh, dear. What happened to them? It's the girl. She's sick. She looked down at the letter still grasped in her paw. If I had told you that running away had been the right thing to do, the old ex-queen wondered, would you still have left me? My brother and I don't really know how to deal with it, because she's a robot or something. But I just thought I'd let you know, we're trying our best. Toriel stood up, pocketing the crumpled letter. Wait here for me, she told her friend. I shall join you shortly. Before she turned back down the long stone corridor, she thought she heard her mysterious friend breathe a sigh of relief from the other side of the door. Nines futilely mopped up the sweat on his brow as he trudged through the awful heat toward Alfie's lab. The sparkling white building shimmered in the heat haze. The larger it grew, the wider his smile grew. I'm almost here, 2B. We'll have you fixed up before you know it. Unit 9S, Pod 153 called out. Transmission received from Pod 042. 2B's condition has stabilized and will likely remain stable in the near future. Nines felt an icy hand's talons peel away from his black box. He'd been worried he'd wasted too much time with his run-in with the law. For a few seconds, he couldn't move or speak from how overwhelmed he was with relief. Thanks, 153. You are also receiving a cellular telephone transmission from Papyrus. Put him on. An audio spectrogram popped up on 9SS HUD in tandem with Papyrus' booming, nasally voice ringing in his ears. Hello, my new best friend, 9S, the gregarious skeleton said. Please accept nothing but the humblest apologies from me, the great Papyrus, for being unable to convince Captain Undyne of your trustworthiness. I know for sure that she will come around to you. But as for right now, her opinion of you is a little, murder why? That's one thing we can almost agree on, Nines thought. You can say that again. But like everybody else, she's really an amazing person once you get to know her. Like everybody else. Nines let out a bitter chuckle. Boy, you're optimistic, aren't you? Don't worry, Nines. I have an excellent idea. I know it's excellent, because I came up with it all by myself. Later this week I will be visiting Captain Undyne for cooking lessons. Giving or receiving? Nines wondered aloud, unsure which prospect was more unnerving. I will bring you along as my +1 and make sure you and Undyne get to know each other politely and peacefully. What do you say, friend? I'm not sure. Might have to take a rain check on that. Say, why do monsters hate humans so much anyway? Oh, I wouldn't say hate. After all, long ago, thousands of years ago, humans and monsters lived in peace. Papyrus cleared his throat. But one day, a monster accidentally killed a human, or maybe the other way around, and the humans declared war. We lacked the strength to fight back and were imprisoned in this mountain by a magical barrier. We call it, the barrier. Huh. Imaginative. So, is there any way through the barrier? Well, if a human takes the soul of a monster, or vice versa, they can pass through. Papyrus paused. But that only happened a long time ago. Right now, our king is trying to collect 7 human souls to shatter the barrier completely. It's a tough job, but if anyone can do it, it's King Ascari. Human souls. Well, there weren't any of those on Earth. There's no other way out. He could almost hear Papyrus shrug over the phone. It's magic. There's no science-why way around it. Huh. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. So will 2B and I be trapped forever down here? Nines wondered. So, can you tell me a little more about the kingdom in general? Cities, regions, that sort of stuff. Well, after the war ended, our king started a little city in the mountain. He called it home. But home was crowded and cramped and dark, and so we went deeper into the mountain. Just about everyone left home behind. The monsters who could stand the cold settled in Snowdon, the monsters who liked it wet and dark settled in Waterfall, and the ones who liked it hot and uncomfortable settled in Hotland. I take it you don't like Hotland very much. No, I like sweat running off my bones very much. It is an excellent place to exercise if you plan to lose a lot of weight. You're a skeleton. Anyway, everybody else went to live in the center of the mountain, where the king built his new castle. He called the city around it New Home. Are you all this bad at naming things? No, just King Ascari. Why do you let him name things, then? Excuse me. Oh, right. He's a king. Nines chuckled as he reached the door to the lab. Hey, Papyrus, I've made it to Alfie's lab, so why don't I call you back? No problem, friend. Papyrus hung up, leaving Nines alone in front of the big double door leading into the laboratory. Nines looked around for a buzzer, and seeing none, knocked on the door. He waited, tapping his foot, but there was no response. Of course, he wasn't one to let that stop him. He hacked into the door and was immediately greeted with a maze of firewalls. Looks like Dr. Alphys values her privacy, Nines thought. But I value 2B's life more. 2B came to while sitting upright on a couch with an old CRT monitor in front of her. This wasn't the house of the skeletons who'd taken her, and this was another vision. She wanted to look around, but her body was moving of its own volition, and all it seemed interested in was the little white-furred monster boy in a green sweater shoving a black rectangle into a slot beneath the screen. She caught a glimpse of magnetic tape spooled inside the black object through a transparent window on its face. "This is your idea of mischief?" she heard herself ask in an unfamiliar voice, sounding bored. She rolled her eyes. The little boy scrambled away from the screen and pounced onto the couch next to her, eagerly kicking his little feet. "I can only watch these old tapes from the surface when Mom and Dad are out, and they're gonna be out all day." 2B picked up an empty cardboard case the same dimensions as the tape, the colorful images and text printed on all sides worn and faded. Front and center on the case was a picture of a grizzled, muscular man with half of the skin on his face torn away, revealing a gleaming metal skull and machinery underneath. It was a fictional image, but familiar nonetheless. Was that what ancient humans of the long-ago year of 1991 AD had imagined androids would look like? "And this is your favorite?" she asked. "Yeah." The kid pressed a button on a remote control and the screen flashed blue before displaying warbling sound and distorted images. "I've never actually watched it all the way through, though," he said, "because Mom and Dad would always come home early, and also what?" The child buried his snout in the crook of 2B's elbow. "Also it's really scary," he warbled, his voice muffled, "and I wanna watch it with you, so, maybe I won't be scared." 2B heard a laugh escape her throat as she threw an arm around the little kid. "Sure," she said, pulling him close to her. "Let's watch this thing. What if you get scared? I came from the surface. Nothing can scare me anymore." The child nuzzled her shoulder. "You're the best big sibster ever." 2B scratched behind his ear. "You're not so bad of a brother yourself." 2B cracked open her eyes. She was lying on something much softer now, a couch, from the feel of it, with a ragged blanket hastily draped on top of her. It was a welcome change from the table. At her side was a steaming, sickly sweet-smelling bowl of unidentifiable soup atop a fold-out tray table. Pod 042 hovered over it, its manipulator claws pinching the sides of the bowl. If Unit 2B would desire it, this support unit would gladly dispose of this so-called meal. Her head pounded, and the stench of the she hesitated to call it soup only worsened the throbbing pressure inside her skull. Relieved, 2B nodded. "Thank you." Pod 042 lifted up the bowl, taking great care not to spill the concoction within, and hovered away to pour it down a sink elsewhere in the house. In the distance, the front door of the Skeleton Brothers' house swung open. "Thank you so much for bringing me here with you, Sans. You know how much these children mean to me." Toriel? What was she doing here? The Queen in Exile stepped over the threshold and entered the living room, wrapped up head to toe in a thick, hooded brown cloak. She noticed 2B immediately, and as she drew back her hood, her eyes brightened. "Ah, do not be alarmed, 2B. 2B corrected her. "I know I must be unrecognizable without my regal bearing and purple garments," Toriel said, "but it is simply me, Toriel, in disguise as a mysterious hooded figure. You look a great deal better than I expected. Mr. Sans here had me believing you were on death's door." She shivered. "My word, it is cold in here." "That's because we've opened all the windows," Papyrus called out from the kitchen. Toriel rested a thick, furry paw on 2B's forehead, then sharply withdrew it with a little gasp. "Oh, dear. You are burning up." And as those words left her mouth, she raised her paw to her mouth and drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders as if she had seen a ghost. Is there anything I can do for you, my child?" "Anything at all." Your offer is appreciated, 2B answered, but, unnecessary nines will take care of everything. Toriel gave her a sympathetic little frown before walking away. However, she returned moments later with a damp washcloth and a bucket of ice. A child of mine had a terrible fever once and I was simply beside myself. I may not be able to cure what ails you, she said, brushing the hair out of 2B's eyes before wrapping the cloth around a few ice cubes and resting it atop her forehead, but I do hope my presence proves somewhat. What did you write in your letter, again? Somewhat appreciated. As soon as the cloth-covered ice brushed against her skin, 2B felt the ache in her head fade away to a dull, nearly imperceptible throbbing. Even her fuzzed-over vision seemed a little crisper. She did not know what to say to this woman in response to her kindness. Toriel and her ex-husband were shockingly similar to each other. No, there was another word you wrote and crossed out, Toriel said, and it started with a C and ended with an ing. What was it? Comforting, 2B admitted in a small voice. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that. Never mind. How do you know Sans? 2B asked, not sure how to feel about that. As fortune would have it, we trade knock-knock jokes once a week. Toriel adjusted the ice pack. Now, as happy as I am to see you, it was awfully rude of you, she chided 2B, to leave without saying goodbye. The pang of regret 2B felt over killing her once, albeit in a timeline that no longer existed, came back stronger. It was a profoundly irrational feeling. Toriel was quite clearly alive here, but it was the same ache she felt having witnessed nines die so many times over. For as much of a pain as they were, at least her emotions were having the decency to be consistent. Happy to see me? Why? 2B asked. Because. May I tell you a story? I am hardly in a position to refuse. Toriel bowed her head. I had 2 children once, a long time ago. My firstborn, Asriel, was nearly perfect. Polite, obedient, well-behaved, and above all, kind. A mother's dream. But he was so very lonely, the other children feared to play with him due to his royal lineage. One day, he met a human who fell from the surface, and at first sight, the two became inseparable. Asriel and Chara. A more perfect friendship the kingdom had never seen. Chara. 2B let the name run through her head. The name she'd heard on a whisper through the void. The name that Flower had kept calling her. The memories she was inexplicably reliving must have belonged to them. They couldn't possibly have been a human, though, so where had they come from and what were they? To Asriel, Chara was the older sibling he had always longed for. And my husband and I loved them as well, though they could not have been more different from our darling Asriel. But one day, Toriel fell silent. 2B closed her eyes, but was not greeted by darkness. Rather, another daydream pulled itself through the mists of her subconscious. She was lying on top of a bed stripped of its covers, a rough towel between her and the naked mattress. The child she'd seen in her vision earlier was crouched at her side with a sharp, shiny knife in his trembling paws. I told you where to make the incision, she told the boy in a voice that was not her own. It is child's play. The boy shook his head, his long ears flopping, eyes squeezed shut. I don't want to do this. What's the matter? She asked the boy. Don't you want to be free? The boy brought the knife to her side, but still kept his eyes shut. But I don't want to stab you. You're not stabbing me, you're cutting me open. There won't even be a lot of blood. Listen to me. It's just like that part in the movie, okay? When they open up the robot's skull and take out the CPU. There's just one little thing you have to do, and then we will become as a god. 2B opened her eyes and found herself once more inside Sans and Papyrus' dingy living room. Her fugue state had come to an end. One day, Toriel said after a long pause, Chara grew deathly ill. Feverish, weak, and helpless. They asked if they could be brought back to the village where they had been born and raised, but that night, they expired with their dying wish unfulfilled. 2B's mind was abuzz with questions, each one more inappropriate than the last. The more she learned about Chara, the less sense everything about them seemed to make. Each person who has fallen down here since reminds me so much of them. But you and your friend especially, 2B. Toriel smiled. Why, when Chara fell, they were even wearing a blindfold just like yours. The ice pack resting on 2B's forehead felt lukewarm compared to the chill that ran up her spine. Did you ever learn why they came here? She asked. Toriel shook her head. No. I don't believe they told anybody. But I think I know. They were running away from something, and whatever it was, I trust that they had good reason to run from it. That is what you are doing down here, too, is it not? 2B closed her eyes. I came here by accident, she insisted to the kindly old monster. But I wished to escape this cycle of death, she thought. Deep down. I think I always have. The door slid open and Nines slipped inside. The lights were on and he could hear the humming of machinery and server banks, but he didn't see anybody home at first. The lab had a vast production floor with a smooth concrete surface, machinery strewed all over. Bright, pastel-colored posters depicting cartoonish imagery blanketed the walls. In one corner was a work table lit by a single bare light bulb, in another sat a terminal with a meter-tall monitor. Nines looked at the image on screen and saw the back of his own head. He turned around and saw the glint of a camera lens set into the seam between wall and ceiling. Nines cleared his throat. Dr. Alphys, he called out. Hello. Oh, hi. Hello. A lemon-yellow monster who looked rather like a small, featherless dinosaur poked her head out from behind a wire-draped server tower, slipping a handful of tools into the pocket of her lab coat as she waved and blinked at Nines through thick, horn-rimmed glasses. You must be, Nines, right? B-boy, are you here a little early? Dr. Alphys, I presume. Nines waved back. Nice to meet you. I wait. How do you know my name? Alphys dove back behind the server and poked her head out again. Lucky guess. She started walking over to Nines. Sorry. I'm just so excited to finally meet an actual android. I could learn so much from you, I'm just. How do you know I'm an android? Nines asked. Lucky, Alphys' scales turned a pale shade of yellow as she froze in place, did an about-face, and started running back toward the server she'd been hiding behind, the thick tail protruding from under her rumpled lab coat sliding across the floor behind her. Wait. Nines threw out his hands. Wait, I need to talk to you. Sorry, I have cameras and microphones hidden all the way through Waterfall, Alphys explained, the words tumbling from her mouth, and so I kinda picked up some of your conversations with Captain Undine. She wrung her scaly little hands. So, what can I do you for? I mean, what can I do for you? I mean, how can I do you? You, got it right the second time. I need your help. If I could have you manufacture a valve for a coolant circulation system, Nines gestured to his pod. Pod 153 here has the specs, so. Alphys rolled back her sleeve and checked her wristwatch. Yeah, sounds great, she said, hurriedly pulling her sleeve back down. Let's go upstairs and talk about it, okay? Just, as soon as P. And then the wall exploded, loosing a shower of pulverized plaster and a cloud of dust. Oh, no. Alphys wailed. Oh, yeah, a smooth, low, sultry male voice called out from within the hole. Nines readied his sword as out from the cloud of dust stepped out, or rather, rolled out a boxy machine balancing on a single wheel. As it swayed back and forth, the grid of lit-up squares on its face flashed in many colors. 2 arms emerged from its sides, capped with white-gloved hands. You can put away your sword, Alphys told Nines. That's Met Aden, the Underground's greatest TV star, and he's immune to all weapons. We'll see. Nines pointed at the machine. Pod 153, execute Program R. Met Aden covered the distance between himself and Nines far faster than Nines had anticipated and instantly began shaking Pod 153's manipulator claw. And who have we here? Why, it's like looking into a gorgeous, but substantially less handsome, mirror. May I have your name? Nines shook his head. Pod 153, don't. Pod 153. Met Aden swung around, leading Pod 153 in an awkward waltz. What a beautiful name for such a beautiful. Pod 153 tried to pull away. Statement: dancing is not within this support unit's range of functions. A beautiful woman. Met-Aten cried. Darling, I am in love. Will you make me the happiest metal-bodied monster alive? Marriage is not within this support unit's range of functions. Pod 153 pulled free and rejoined Nines. Nines took a combat stance. All right, machine. You wanna dance? Let's. Machine. Machine. Met-Aten's lights turned red. I am not a machine. I am a robotic monster with an invulnerable metal body. He rolled over to Nines, reaching into himself and pulling out a microphone. And you are? Met-Aten asked, shoving the microphone into 9SS face. 9SS sword clanged off the side of Metatron's body. So he hadn't been kidding about the whole invulnerable thing. Met-Aten ignored the attempted assault and gently pushed the microphone up to 9SS lips. And you are, he repeated. 9S. The microphone popped and squealed with feedback, and Met-Aten pulled it away. Incredible. It's like you've never spoken into a mic before, he grumbled. Give it up for our latest contestant, folks at home. 9S. Nines glanced over at Alphys. She gave him a thumbs up. Now it's time for our favorite game show, Humans, What Do They Know? Do they know things? Let's find out. Actually, I'd like it a lot if you left. Never played before, gorgeous? No problem, it's simple. There's only one rule, answer correctly, or you die. Just go with it. Alphys called out to Nines. He's harmless, really. Met-Aten wagged his finger at her. No helping the contestant, Dr. Alphys. That's prohibited. You just said there was only one rule, said Nines. Quiet, you. Let's start with an easy question. Met-Aten roared. What's the prize for answering this question correctly? Is it A. Money. B. Mercy. C. A new car. D. More questions. Met-Aten handed the mic to Nines. Nines made sure not to get his mouth too close to it this time. A, he said. Ha. You wish. Wrong. The answer was D, more questions. Met-Aten waved his hand and an electric jolt shot through 9SS leg, sending him falling to his knee. And speaking of more questions, here's. Nines picked himself up. I thought you said I'd die if I answered wrong, he taunted Met-Aten, smirking defiantly. Ha, ha 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 ha. Shut up. Next question, what's the king's full name? Is it A. Lord Fluffy Buns. B. Fuzzy Pushover. C. Askary Dreamer. D. Dr. Friendship. Nines considered hacking Met-Aten and pulling the answer directly from the maniacal metal monster's mind, but when he tried to get a beat on him, nothing happened. Apparently, Met-Aten had nothing Nines could hack. A Askary Dreamer? Nines guessed. Of course. I can see you've spent more than an hour down here. Now, what are robots made of? Is it A. Hopes and dreams. B. Met. The answer came to Nines by rote. He stood at rapt attention and sharply saluted. Sir. Robots are made of synthetic parts and circuitry designed to imitate and improve upon organic life, organized within a metal, plastic, or carbon fiber carapace around a central processor and power supply unit. These units take the forms of machine cores or your high-issue black box units. Sir. Met-Aten didn't have a face, but if he did, he would have looked utterly gobsmacked. That wasn't even one of your choices. Wrong. Wrong and bad. He snapped his fingers and a bolt of electricity shot through 9SS chest, nearly throwing him off his feet, the pain sending waves of static across his visual display and through his mind. Too bad Alphys can't help. Nines fell to his knees and winced as he tried to clear his head of the pain, then glanced over at Alphys, who had been surreptitiously making a bee out of her clawed fingers the whole time. She tried to smile at him, but it came out as more of a grimace. Nines sighed, stood up, and kept playing, answering even the most obtuse and asinine of Met-Aten's inquiries correctly with Dr. Alphys' help. Time to break out the big guns. Met-Aten announced. In the anime dating simulation game Mew Mew Kissy Cutie, what is Mew Mew's favorite food? Is it? Alphys rushed over and nearly ripped the microphone from Metaten's hand. Oh. Oh. I know this one. It's snail ice cream. In Chapter 4, she buys it for all her friends even though she's the only one who likes it, and it's a powerful message about friendship, and, she pushed the microphone away. It just slipped out, honest. Oh, Alphys. Alphys, Alphys, Alphys. Alphys. Metaten shook his head, or rather, he swayed his body from side to side as if he were shaking his head. You've been helping our dim-witted human contestant, haven't you? For the last time, I'm not a human, Nines pointed out. Wait, why did I object to that and not dim-witted? Well, if that's the case, Metaten's face panel lit up. How about I ask a question you're sure to know the answer to? Who does Dr. Alphys have a crush on? Is it A. Captain Undyne, B. King Ascari Dreamer, C. Nines, D. Someone even more embarrassing? Nines looked over at Alphys. Her cheeks had turned bright red, and the color was spreading. Answer B would make sense, he thought, since authoritarian leaders typically have cults of personality surrounding them. As for A, though, she had cameras installed throughout Waterfall, and what could those have been for but to watch the object of her affections from afar? C, well, she was pretty nervous around me when I came here, and those cameras were watching me, too, so maybe. He looked back to Alphys. Her entire face had flushed beet red. Nines could tell that any answer he gave would be equally mortifying. But what if he could halt the broadcast? Metaten, Nines asked, this is a family-friendly show, right? Of course. It's the only show on television. It has to be family-friendly. The lights on Metaten's face grouped together in what might have been a wink. Rest assured, the answer you give won't lead to anything saucy or risque. Nines took the microphone and brought it a comfortable distance away from his lips. He took a deep breath. Fuck. Cut the broadcast. Metaten shouted out in a hurried attempt to cover up 9's outburst of profanity. Fuck you, you fucking son of a bitch. Nines retorted. Stop it. Metaten cried. This station could lose its TV license over this. Good. Nines said. Your show fucking sucks. I hope your metal ass roasts in hell, you bastard. I hope you shit fucking nails every day for the rest of your miserable goddamn fucking life. You'd better fucking. I can't hear you. The viewers can't hear you. Your ratings poison. You'll never be on television again. Good day to you, sir. Metaten hurried out of the lab through the same hole in the wall he'd come in through, the microphone squealing as it fell from his hand onto the floor. Nines and Alphys both let out long, relieved sighs in unison. He had to admit that after that little outburst, he felt a lot less tense. That was brilliant, 9's. Alphys gasped. Thank you so much. No problem. Nines collapsed to his knees and would have fallen to the floor had Pod 153 not swooped in to prop him up. Thanks, 153. He gave the pod a weak little fist bump. I am so sorry about all of that, Alphys said, helping Nines to his feet. Metaten's a good friend of mine, or at least he was, and ever since he's become a TV star everything's just gone straight to his head. Why you're lucky I was here to feed you the right answers. I bet you wouldn't have lasted much longer against those shocks. So, what did you come here for, again? Everything came tumbling out of 9's mouth as his mission came back to him. I've got a friend in Snowdon whose coolant circulation system has broken down. Her name's 2B. She's my partner. I'm in charge of her maintenance, but there's a valve that needs replacing and I don't have the spare parts for it. Pod 153 has the schematics. If you could fabricate the valve I need, I could. Alphys' eyes lit up. Yes, she squealed. Yes, I could. I'd love to. I just a real live android? Of course. I've only ever worked on Black BI, I've only ever worked on simple robots, why like Metaten's shell, or... Nines smiled. He'd done it. Rest easy, 2B. You're gonna be good as new. Chapter 8, B Chirality. Nines stepped off the boat and onto the snowy dock shivering in anticipation, while Dr. Alphys stood at his side and shivered from the cold. He couldn't believe so much had gotten done so quickly. The skies had only just begun to darken by the time Alphys had fabricated the parts he needed. He couldn't believe that for an introvert, Alphys could talk so much about some incomprehensible thing she called anime. He also couldn't believe that I could have taken this boat to Hotland instead of walking the whole time. Papyrus didn't tell you that? Alphys asked as her teeth chattered like castanets. She tried blowing on her hands to warm them but only succeeded in blowing a foggy cloud of condensed air through her fingers. The things I do for love, she grumbled under her breath. Nines looked down at her with bemusement. Oh, of science. Alphys protested, still rankled from Metaton's embarrassing quiz show. This is already hard enough, she said, stomping through the snow toward Papyrus' house. Nines caught up with her rather quickly since his legs were so much longer, pulled off his coat, and offered it to her. Alphys snatched it right out of his hands and pulled it over her shoulders. Thanks, Nines. Why I'm not too good with people, or CC cold, Alphys admitted, both of which were obvious, but I'm just so excited about seeing the inside of an android. Nines clutched his repaired satchel to his chest. It was hard to believe that in this small package was a small piece of simple machinery that would render 2B just as strong and capable as ever before. Mechanical things including androids, and yes, even machine life forms really were remarkable. He and Alphys stepped through the front door of Papyrus and Sans home. Alphys immediately groaned. Oh, come on. It's almost as cold in here as it is out there. Sans poked his head out of his room. Oh. Hey, Alphys. Fancy seeing you here. Alphys' eyes narrowed behind her glasses. Oh. Hello. Sans, she replied, her voice as frosty as the air. 2B. Nines called out. Papyrus emerged from the kitchen. Still sleeping like a baby, I'm afraid. Which is an expression that never made sense to me, as babies are notorious for causing a racket day and night. She is sleeping better than a baby if anything. Nines rounded the corner and saw his partner right where he'd left her. 2B lay in peaceful repose on a battered and tattered couch, her eyes closed, her chest gently rising and falling under a patched-up blanket. Seeing her ill made his black box ache, but seeing her sleeping so soundly soothed it. Alphys followed him. Is that? She bit her lip. Oh dear. A pang of panic struck Nines. Something wrong, doctor? Alphys shook her head, a tinge of pink coming to her scaly cheeks. And no, I'm just, oh geez, your friends are really, really cute. Pod 042 hovered at 2B's side while a tall, white-furred monster in a ragged brown cloak sat on a stool beside the couch, cradling 2B's hand in her paw. When the monster noticed Nines, she set 2B's hand down over her chest, leaped to her feet, and wrapped her arms around Nines. Ah, Nines. Do not be alarmed. It is I, Toriel, walking among the citizens of this town in disguise. Alphys gasped. Queen Toriel. She started bowing profusely, her snout nearly brushing against the wooden floorboards. Why, your royal Highness, I am, the honor is all mine, your Grace, your... Nines was taken aback. Queen Toriel. Toriel backed away, holding up her hands. And no, who is this Toriel you speak of? I am simply a wandering vagabond with no royal blood whatsoever. My name is, she scratched her chin. Tori. Terry. Teriel. Toriel let her choice of name hang in the air for a few seconds before burying her face in her hands. Nailed it. Sans called out. Good lord, she muttered, I have gotten almost as bad at names as my ex. Nice to see you again, Toriel. Sorry for leaving so suddenly. Nines smiled and adjusted his gloves. Come on. Let's prep the patient for surgery. The doctor is in. Best of luck, my child. Toriel patted him on the back and handed him a bar of some waxy substance. But first, take this. Nines looked down at the object Toriel had placed in his hand. It was roughly lozenge-shaped, a little slippery, and smelled faintly of aloe and cucumber. "What is this?" he asked. "It is soap." Thanks," said Nines, offering the bar of soap back to Toriel, "but we androids don't really need to worry about sterile." Toriel laughed. "Oh, no, my child. That is not for your hands. That is to wash out your mouth for all that vulgar language you used on live television." In the Skeleton Brothers' kitchen, its door shut as tightly as possible to afford the patient some privacy, Nines stripped 2B down to access the segment of the cooling system nearest to her black box, keeping a blanket draped over her lower half for modesty. Then, running his finger along the near-invisible seams in her skin and the chassis beneath it, Nines separated and removed 2B's chest, gingerly setting it on the freshly wiped kitchen counter behind him. Right now, 2B was in a low-power mode, with all higher functions disabled for the moment, but still with enough power running to her organs to allow him and Pod 042 to run on-the-fly diagnostics. Nines looked inside and immediately every trace of self-confidence within him evaporated. He'd seen this so many times before 2B's vulnerable body beneath his hands as he peered into her and assessed her circulatory systems, her respiratory systems, her internal skeleton, the black box perched just under her sternum as it glittered with what looked like trapped starlight, but it was different this time. This time, if he did anything wrong, 2B would die. Of course, that had been true before, but after failing so miserably to take care of 2B over the past day, Nines had never had less faith in his own abilities than he did at this moment. Pod 153 and Pod 042 hovered beside him, one over each shoulder. Data flickered across his HUD as a targeting reticule locked onto the location of the faulty valve. Nines swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "Pod 042, can I get a reading?" "Analysis, black box temperature and pressure are currently 200% above normal values." His fingers trembled as they touched down over 2B's carbon fiber ribs, slipping on the cool surfaces as they glided to the sets of arteries and veins pumping synthetic blood and coolant through 2B's body. Nines froze. He couldn't do this. 2B's life was in his hands and he couldn't do this. He'd come all this way nearly across the kingdom and back again, endured an attack from machine life forms, run from a bloodthirsty fish-faced monster, braved a hellish television program, listened to Alphys talk about cartoons, and after all that, after everything he'd done, he couldn't do this. But wrist deep in 2B's chest cavity, like he'd done a dozen times before, he realized that he couldn't do this. Nines took a dazed step back, drawing back his hands. 2B lay there gutted like a fish, her still moving organs on full display in front of him. Alphys looked up at him, still wrapped in his own coat, still shivering from the cold that permeated the makeshift kitchen-cum-operating theater. "Why, you okay there, 9S?" A moan escaped 9S's lips. No, more of a squeak than a moan. He was terrified. Everything he knew about android maintenance and surgery had vanished from his mind. He couldn't remember what tools to use to get at the affected subsystem without damaging another component. He didn't know how to remove the damaged valve or how to orientate the replacement properly. All of that information had drained from his mind like water from a sieve. He didn't know anything. It was all gone now. He didn't know anything except that he was in over his head and his closest companion's life was in his hands and he couldn't save her. Nines fell to his knees, his chest violently heaving as he sobbed into his hands. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I can't. I don't know. I can't remember." At first, 2B thought she was having another vision. But the white void she found herself standing in the middle of was nothing like the settings of her previous visions, and as she looked around for any sign of, well, anything, there wasn't any. She realized that she was in control of her own body. "9S, she called out. "Pod. Greetings." 2B whirled around to face the origin of the voice, drawing her sword and shifting by instinct into a combat stance. A few paces away from her stood a young adult with pale, ashen skin, rosy cheeks, and brown hair cut into a shoulder-length bob. Their clothes were similar to those worn by Toriel, albeit tailored to their far more slender frame. They wore an ankle-length, sleeved white chiton, and over it, a sleeveless tunic sewed from violet silk stretching down to their ankles and girded by a cincture of shimmering silver cloth. The same emblem 2B had seen on Toriel's robes, a series of triangles flanked by a pair of wings, was emblazoned on the chest of the tunic, white fabric stitched into the violet. "It's me," said the stranger. Chara. Plucking a severed length of a rusty chain from their shoulder and casting it aside, they smiled. "As you surely must remember, you are Ha number 2 type E, you and I made a deal, and I'm here to collect." 2B took a deep breath. Collect what? The memory of her conversation with Chara before time had turned back came back to her, but she could only remember what they had said to her, and not vice versa. "We agreed," said Chara, "that one way or another, I would have an avatar with which I would be free to influence the material world." They held out their arms. "Whether or not your dear friend Nines repairs your body successfully, soon you will be in perfect health once again. What a fine vessel you, with your beautiful, deadly body, will make." 2B's grip on her sword tightened. "No," she said. "I'm sorry." Unfortunately, regarding this, Chara whipped a knife out from their side. "You have misunderstood. Since when were you the one in control?" Pod 042 and Pod 153 reached out and lifted Nines back up to his feet, even though all Nines wanted to do was curl up into a ball, and pried his hands away from his face. Statement: Unit 9 possesses all relevant knowledge to repair a Type B android, Pod 153 encouraged him. Statement: Unit 2B would not trust anyone but her companion, Unit 9, to perform such a sensitive operation, Pod 042 chimed in, and she is right to do so. This support unit's records indicate, said Pod 153, that Unit 9 has never made a mistake in android maintenance and surgery. Having thoroughly examined all data collected by Pod 153 and cross-checked it with the data I have collected, I can corroborate with my counterpart that Unit 9 has never made a mistake. Nines took a deep breath to quell the maelstrom of butterflies in his stomach and stepped closer. Alphys piped up, shaking his hand. I don't know how much encouragement I can give, but, as a robotics engineer, android surgery is like riding a bike. You never really forget how to do it." Nines took a deep breath, swallowed the last of his trepidation, and nodded, lifting his visor momentarily to wipe the tears from his eyes. "Right." He took a step toward 2B's body and held his hand out to Alphys. "Doctor, hand me 2 1mm spacers and a set of microforceps." He could do this. 2B's life was in his hands, and he could do this. Why would I agree to that? 2B struck at Chara, knocking away their measly knife and exposing their unprotected chest. She swung her blade across it. Desperation breeds strange alliances. And Chara vanished, reappearing a few paces away. They grinned. "My friend, why so aggressive? It is not in your best interest, trust me. You cannot have my body. Oh, please. By hook or by crook I will have an avatar in the material world once more. That is what we agreed on. As such, I already have joint ownership of this body. All I'm asking for is that my role over it expand, just a little bit. Joint ownership. Who else could have been feeding you my memories? Who else could have been prompting false error messages and inducing random failures across your system? You. A demonstration of my powers." Chara vanished, reappearing behind 2B. "I was even responsible for damaging your coolant system. Of course, I can even fix it for you if Nines proves inadequate." 2B whirled around to face them. "What? I told you, I needed to demonstrate how much control I have over your body." Chara took a bow. "I have kernel-level access to all of your body's automatic and involuntary functions." "Why? I could die." "Oh, no, you won't die. Nines will save you. You trust him, don't you?" 2B lunged for them, striking again. They vanished and reappeared just out of range. "How did you get in?" 042 would have detected your presence. Chara laughed. 2E, please. I'm not a virus. As a phantom, I occupy a higher level than the mere bits and bytes that comprise your conscience, your subconscious, and your unconscious. A phantom. A disembodied soul, if you will, Chara clarified with a regal bow. But how could 042 not have picked up on your influence? The thing about computers, Chara replied, is that falsifying records is incredibly easy. It isn't hard to pull the wool over a pod's metaphorical eyes. They picked at their fingernails as 2B once again failed to land a hit. Now, my friend, my counterpart, you know full well what I can do to you should you refuse my demands. It's high time you stop resisting and let me have control. Chara snapped their fingers and the image of their body rippled and flickered, replacing itself with a perfect replica of 2B's own. Every detail was accounted for, from the lace on her black dress to her black hairband to the mole below the left side of her mouth and her steely gray-blue eyes. Chara curtsied. See. They even had 2B's voice, but the cadence was all wrong. Doesn't this? They did a little pirouette, letting 2B see her own body from every angle. Look good on me? What would you do with my body? She asked. Chara, wearing 2B's shape, smiled a wide and toothy grin, the expression utterly alien on 2B's face. The same thing you've always wished you could do. 2B lunged forward. I wish I could kill you. Again, it was futile. Chara reappeared a few paces away. I see. Their body flickered and distorted again, the dress becoming a short black coat as the shape of their body and face changed. Chara's manic grin looked far less out of place on 9S's face. They unbuttoned their coat and spread it, revealing a thin white shirt underneath. What about this? They asked, now speaking with 9S's voice, relishing in their mockery. How do you feel about killing me now? 2B didn't hesitate, and yet her sword bit through empty air yet again. Chara looked shocked as they reverted to their original shape. They seemed to have access to all of 2B's memories, so how could they have thought 2B would hesitate to attack them just because they had taken on 9S's form? 2B rushed forward one more time, swung her sword, and caught Chara by surprise with the speed and ferocity of her lunge, her blade locking against their knife and drawing sparks before Chara could slip away. You and I, we are not the same after all, are we? Chara dodged 2B's next strike, but with less ease, their sleeve falling away where 2B had sliced through it. Our reflections are asymmetric. Your soul, it resonates with a strange feeling. As they parried 2B's next strike, they wrapped their leg around 2B's ankle and swept her off her feet. 2B picked herself up off the white floor, her head pounding, as Chara continued their monologue. There is a reason you continue to recreate your world, they said. There is a reason you continue to destroy it. 2B struck them again, but Chara knocked away the blade. Her sword's hilt slipped through her sweaty palms and flew out of her hands and grabbed her by her arms, pulling her in a loose embrace. There was a floral scent to their breath as it landed on her face. You, Chara whispered. You are racked with a perverted sentimentality. 2B wrenched herself free and drove her fist into Chara's nose. Blood spurted through the air as Chara stumbled backward, blood seeping through their clasped hands. 2E, trust me when I say it is useless to resist, you are only hurting yourself. 2B scrambled for her sword as the world around her vanished. There were stars out. No, not stars, just glittering diamond dust strewn across a rocky ceiling. She was lying against the wall of one of Waterfall's many meandering tunnels. No, it wasn't her, but she was there and could feel the damp, cool rocks at her back just like she could feel the ground beneath her feet. It was another one of Chara's memories she was being forced to relive. 2B lay on the side of the hill, basking in the starlight as the long and crisp grass, still wet from the rainfall from earlier that day, tickled her ears. She rested her folded hands on her stomach as she looked up at the heavens. A little furry hand tugged on her collar. It was the child from before. Toriel's child. Asriel. The boy was ensconced in a green sweater just a few sizes too big for him and curled up by her side. Hey, Chara. Yeah. The stars really do look different from here, don't they, 9S? 2B murmured. Something about the haze of the atmosphere this far from the smoke-belching machine factories and the muted lights of resistance camps really did make those pinpricks of white light twinkle in a way they never did from the windows of the bunker as it orbited above the Earth. Does the moon really change shape? 2B laughed. Of course it doesn't, Asriel. The boy let out a meek bleat halfway between disappointment and embarrassment. 9 sighed softly as he lay beside her. His gray-blue eyes were open wide in either shock or astonishment, his untied visor tangled up in the wild grass. I know. It's beautiful, isn't it? 2B pulled herself up in a sitting position, ignoring the stinging pain stabbing through her ribcage. The night breeze felt cool on her face, the chill carried on the gentle wind seeping through her dress and soothing the fresh bruises all over her body. No, 2B thought, her knees wobbling as she swept her sword off the ground and swung it against Chara in a wild arc. Chara's reminiscence, obviously meant to stop her from fighting, had triggered a memory of her own. I don't want to remember this. Chara nimbly danced out of range, their smug facade slowly falling away to reveal what seemed like genuine concern. Don't fight it, 2E. Don't struggle against it. Just let the memory come to you like all the others. 9S's fingers began to tremble once again as he worked to isolate 2B's damaged coolant valve. His sleeve brushed against 2B's black box, and even through the fabric he could feel the heat emanating from it. The black box's humming had pitched up to an ear-piercing whine. Pod 042 hovered by his side. Observation: Unit 2B's black box temperature has exceeded 300% normal operational threshold. 9 sucked air in through his teeth. 2B was unconscious and immobile. What processes could possibly be running right now that would tax her CPU so much? In this state, she shouldn't be capable of conscious thought at all. Why? Unknown. But at the rate 2B's temperature is climbing, repairs must be completed within 4.5 minutes before irreversible damage begins to occur to her body. Nines found his fingers frozen again, despite the growing heat emanating from 2B's guts. Damn it. Alphys ran to the fridge, pulled out a few ice cubes in a plastic bag, and hefted the bag of ice onto 2B's black box. The bag immediately began to steam and sweat. Will this help? Nines coughed stale air out of his lungs and took a deep breath. It'll be fine. We'll just have to dry her off before we seal her up. Thanks, Alphys. Chara must have realized they'd hurt Asriel's feelings, because the next words out of 2B's mouth in Chara's voice were a quick retraction. Well, she said, it does change shape, sort of. You see, the moon is a big globe that orbits the Earth. The term for it is natural satellite, and its real name is Luna, if you want to be technical. Okay. Remember our first night on the surface? 2B asked Nines. We had to spend 2 days on foot traveling to the resistance camp, machines hot on our heels, and that first night, you told me you wished you could just lie down and watch the stars come out. I told you not to be so foolish. But, a stony lump grew in her throat. 2B gingerly stripped the glove off her hand and placed it over 9S's hand, giving his a gentle squeeze. Tonight, I almost feel happy, just lying here and stargazing with you. The same side of the moon always faces the Earth, but the way the light from the sun hits it changes what the shadows on its face look like. From new moon, where the shadow covers the side we see completely, to the full moon, where the shadows hide on the other side. The moon never changes. How much of it you can see does? Asriel gasped. That's so neat. And it just keeps doing that. 2B nodded. Yes. It's a cycle, and it goes on forever. You can even set your calendar to it. Some ancient humans planned their lives around its waxing and waning. She thought the kid would be happy, or was that Chara's thought, but instead he lowered his head, his smile fading to a gloomy, morose frown, his eyes downcast. Nines lay there on the grass at 2B's side. He didn't say a word. For once in your life, 2B closed her eyes, suppressing a wistful, pained smile. Do you really have nothing to say, 9S? She let go of 9S's hand, reached over, and grabbed the hilt of her sword. What's the matter, Asriel? 2B put an arm around his shoulder. We're never gonna see it, are we? He whimpered. 2B tugged him closer. Don't worry about it. It's not fair for you to be trapped down here with us. I wish you could see the moon again, Chara. 2B patted him on the head, her fingers tooling his fur. Don't you worry about me, Asriel. We have plenty of stars down here, too. She pointed up at the ceiling. Asriel rested his head on her shoulder. Chara, he murmured, what's the surface like? Please, no, don't, 2B pleaded with her own subconscious as she tried desperately to clear her mind, hacking and slashing at Chara again and again as they evaded every strike. A red fog was crowding her vision. She felt just as feverish here in this realm wherever it was as she did in the outside world. Chara began to sweat. I'm serious, 2E, stop this. Their tone of smug condescension had vanished from their voice altogether. They were terrified. If you die, then I don't know. 2B pressed onward. You don't know what'll happen to you, she snarled. That makes two of us. Let's find out. 2E, no. She knocked the knife out of their hand. With another swing of her sword she forced Chara to vanish again, and then, on a hunch, she twisted around, swinging the sword behind her. The blade hit Chara in the chest and traveled upward in a loose L shape, cutting right between their eyes and leaving a gushing wound all the way up their forehead to their hairline. Severed locks of hair floated in the air between Chara and 2B. Chara stumbled backward, blood spurting from the open cut traveling up their body, the burgundy color of the blood staining their clothes and skin matching the maroon hue of their wide-open eyes as they clutched at their wound. How? Your trick. You move fast, but not far, 1 or 2 paces at the most. I hoped you'd reappear behind me sooner or later. It's not a trick you can rely on. 2B thrust her sword at Chara again, but as her blade whistled through the air she stumbled and fell, images of the past flashing before her eyes once again. I'm sorry it had to happen like this, 2B said, taking a deep breath with her aching lungs as she tried to regain her composure. But I'm glad it happened at all, Nines. It's a horrible place, 2B told Asriel. There's nothing up there but death. All we do on the surface is kill and be killed. You wouldn't want to go up there. She pulled her sword out of 9's chest, wiped the blood and dirt on the grass, and stood up. Nines lay there beside her as still as a statue and silent as a grave, the grass surrounding him slicked with his own blood, black under the cold and unfeeling starlight. Not even for the moon. That was it, then. She called up the bunker. Commander. It's me. Yoarha number 2 Type E. The tremolo vanished from her voice. Mission complete. Yoarha Unit 9 is dead. 2B nodded. Not even for all the stars in the sky. She looked down at what remained of her partner. He was still staring up at the sky with blank, unseeing eyes. She felt sorry for him. She'd meant to stab him right through his black box, a clean, quick kill, but he'd struggled and she'd missed. He'd stopped writhing in agony quite some time ago, but she had known by the residual warmth left on his hand that until just recently he'd still been clinging to life. But if you really wanted to go up there, 2B told Asriel, Chara's voice taking on a somewhat playful tone that seemed almost sinister as it issued from her mouth, I think there is one thing we can do. As 2B stood beside the body of her only and dearest friend, she hoped she'd given Nines some small comfort in his final moments. After all, it was nothing personal. 2B fell on all fours in front of Chara, grasping onto her sword for support as she dug it into the featureless floor to prop herself up. Her chest heaved as her stomach churned and twisted itself into anxious knots, sweat poured down her forehead and soaked her visor. She gagged on her own spit and coughed up bile, translucent and frothing, onto the blank white floor. Was this anguish from the memory, or the sickness? Or both? Good. Good. Settle down, Chara said, wiping the blood from their face as they scuttled across the floor. Just stay there, take deep breaths, get your temperature down. They reached over and picked up their knife. 2B pulled herself to her feet, ignoring her throbbing, aching muscles, and walked over to Chara. Chara held out their hand. If 2B pushed herself to the point of death, all of their plans would die with her, and they clearly knew it just as well as 2B did. You must surrender, 2E. Your exertion in your dream is taxing your CPU in real life. Think about Nines. If you keep straining yourself, you'll overheat and die on the operating table before he can fix the valve I broke. Before I can fix it. He'll live with your death on his conscience. 2B flipped her sword in an ice-pick grip, placing her open palm against the pommel, and drew it back, ready to stab it through Chara's heart. Get out of my body. Chara threw out their hands over their face in a wordless plea for mercy. 2B thrust the sword. Nines withdrew his fingers and the coolant-stained pad he'd used to soak up any minor spills, sighing in relief as he removed the bag of water, which had once been ice, from atop 2B's black box and toweled off the condensation that remained. The damaged valve, less than half the size of 9's fingernail, sat on the tip of his finger. He couldn't imagine how he'd missed it before. Even with the naked eye, he could clearly see that its tiny mechanisms had seized up. He gave the repaired circulatory system enough time to level out to a stable equilibrium, holding his breath all the while. The wait felt like an eternity, but if the lowering pitch and frequency of the humming black box was any indication. 153, he said, give me a reading on 2B's black box temperature and pressure. Analysis, temperature and pressure approaching optimum levels 127% and falling. 113%. 102%. 100%. He sighed in relief, wiping sweat from his brow. Nines was so exhausted that he wanted to fall asleep right then and there. He grabbed 2B's removed chest plate off the counter, reapplied it, drew the blanket up to her shoulders, and gave Pod 042 the okay to start the reboot sequence. Pod 042 verbally recounted the sequence while Nines waited, air hissing through his gritted teeth. Alphys had her fingers crossed and her eyes squeezed shut. Commencing system check. Memory unit, green. Initializing tactics log. Loading geographic data. Vitals, green. Remaining MP, 100%. Black box temperature, normal. Black box internal pressure, normal. Activating IFF. Activating FCS. Initializing pod connection. Launching DBU setup. Activating inertia control system. Activating environmental sensors. Equipment status, green. All systems green. Combat preparations complete _. 2B shot bolt upright, her eyes snapping open. Her chest heaved from exertion as her eyes darted to and fro. The purgatory she'd been trapped in had vanished, what little of it there was to vanish. Chara was gone, or so she hoped. She was in the kitchen again, sitting on top of the table with a blanket draped over her lap. Nines was standing next to her, and at his side was a short yellow monster who looked like a chubby, featherless dinosaur and was currently refusing to look at her. The monster was wearing 9SS coat. 9SS face broke out in a relieved, exhausted grin. 2B. He threw himself at her, burying his face in her shoulder as he wrapped his arms around her back. He was even more out of breath than she was. 2B could feel his chest rising and falling against hers. It worked. We did it. His voice cracked. We did it. 2B. 2B closed her eyes, the intruder in her head momentarily forgotten. She felt as good as new for the first time in what had felt like an eternity. Thank you, 9S. Her fingers brushed against the back of his sweat-drenched neck. Nines helped her off the table. It was touch and go for a while there. 2B shook her head. You have no idea. The scaly monster at 9S's side grabbed a bundle from off the counter and tried to hand it to 2B as best she could without looking at her. And nice to meet you, Miss 2B. Please, please take your clothes. 2B gladly snatched up her clothing as Nines and his new friend high-fived and slipped out of the room to afford her some privacy. As 2B got dressed, the clarity in her head felt more invigorating than she could have possibly anticipated. Pod 042 hovered over to 2B's side as observation, Unit 2B, it is nice to have you fully operational. 2B finished pulling on her gloves and wrapping her visor over her eyes, then patted her pod on the top of its hull. I missed you, too, 042. She pulled the door open, stepped out, and instantly found herself buried under an avalanche of white fur. Later that night, after she'd started feeling more like her old self, 2B found herself sitting on the freshly severed stump of a tree as snow dusted the shoulders of her black dress. From here, just past the town's ill-defined perimeter, she could see the few remaining soft amber lights that lit up the tiny town of Snowdon as the sky darkened to pitch black. The sky overhead was like the night sky during a new moon, except there were no stars. It actually felt unnerving to know that despite the changing light throughout the day, up above was no sky but a vast stone ceiling covered by clouds. The monsters must have been used to it by now, though. I hope I do not sound mentally unsound, she confessed to Pod 042 after telling it about her encounter with Chara. Her fingers tapped against the hilt of her sword as it stuck out from the stump. I can scarcely believe it myself. Statement: this support unit would normally find your story hard to believe, Pod 042 responded. However, this unit did suspect the interference of a third party. It was the only explanation that remained charitable both to your faculties and my own. Thank you for believing me. 2B stretched her arms, still stiff, sore, and aching. But, knowing how they can alter the information passed between us, how can we ever trust each other again? I will implement new checksum and hashing protocols to ensure that transferred data is replicated accurately. I suppose that's the best we can do for now. Nines stepped into the clearing, nearly tripping over a root buried under the snow. Hey, 2B. You're not planning on sleeping in the woods tonight, are you? 9S. You have your coat back. 2B adjusted her position on the stump to clear some room for him to sit down. Yeah. Alphys had enough of the cold and took the next boat home. Nines took a seat. So, he paused. This is hard to say, but I did some poking around. Asking around. About how to get back to the surface. Yes. Nines opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked down at his feet. There was something special about humans and monsters. Their souls, they fit together like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle or a key in a padlock. A single human can pass through the barrier if they absorb the soul of a monster. A human. 2B knew that from her previous reset, although she couldn't let Nines know that. You don't think we can leave? Nines shook his head. No, For a few seconds, the words hung in the frigid air like the cloud of frozen breath that came from 9S's mouth. I do think that, Nines admitted, slumping his shoulders. I think we're stuck here, just like everyone else. Cut off from the bunker, cut off from Yorha, cut off from the war, from everyone we know. Snow continued to fall from the sky, scattered white flakes twinkling as they whirled and tumbled through the air. But I'll keep looking, Nines concluded. I'll keep looking. Does it feel strange to you, 9S, 2B mused as she stared up at the starless sky, to be here, in what may be the only place on this planet untouched by war? She didn't realize it until later, but she had rested her hand on top of his. Just like that fateful night so long ago. But they were under a different sky now. A different sky. A different tomorrow. It's like an oasis, isn't it, said 2B. Yeah, I guess. Nines nodded. You know, humans didn't spend all their lives fighting, he continued. They weren't born ready for battle. They didn't spend each day afraid it would be their last. They busied themselves with arts and music and this thing I read about once called white-collar work. Even in times of war, only a small fraction of them chose to fight, the rest stayed at home and went on with their lives. 2B could hear Chara's voice echo in her mind. It's a horrible place. There's nothing up there but death. All we do on the surface is kill and be killed. You wouldn't want to go up there. Not even for all the stars in the sky. Does it make me a coward, or a deserter, or a traitor? Nines asked, his voice trembling. If I keep wondering what it would be like to live like that. Perhaps, said 2B, we should see what peace feels like. Why yeah. Nines laughed off his nervousness, the melancholy slowly fading from his voice. So if when we find a way back to the surface, we can tell everyone else what it's like to live like this. Who knows? He pulled off his visor and let it hang around his neck, and as he closed his eyes and let out a deep, satisfied sigh, 2B could see that his eyes had been glistening with tears. Maybe that's what it'll take to end the war, he said. 2B untied her own visor and laid it across her lap. She hoped this peace would last, but for how long she hoped it would last, she did not herself know. Personally, she hoped she would never have to leave and that Nines would feel the same soon enough. But she knew better. After all, there was nothing 2B knew quite so well as the fact that nothing could last forever. Ending B, the best is yet to come. Chapter 9, See End of the Unknown. 14E held the shining blade of her Otaki to 2E's neck, twisting the 170-centimeter blade ever so slightly and nicking her skin. 2E froze in place, still holding her own sword out, its tip nearly touching her sparring partner's chest. You did better, said 14E, pulling the meter-long blade back and allowing 2E to wipe the thin trace of blood from her throat. Again. 2E nodded, raised her sword, and engaged 14E in a flurry of blades. She'd only been activated 1 month ago, 14E had been active for much longer. Yet already she could feel herself gaining ground on the skillful swords mistress of the Type E division. 14E's Otoki had greater reach and cut through the air with unimaginable strength, but it was slow and unwieldy compared to 2E's lighter and shorter katana. The difference between the two androids' weapons made up for the vast gulf in skill between novice and veteran, or, at least, that was what 2E had thought. A parried thrust, a riposte, a nanometer-sharp blade closing in on an unprotected chest, that was all it should have taken. But 2E only managed to nick 14E's side, while 14E brought their terrible long blade down and severed 2E's arm at the shoulder. Reeling, blood spurting from the sharp and clean cut, 2E slipped on the training mat blanketing the floor, lowering her center of gravity and snatching up her sword from her own discarded, severed right arm. She tossed the blade at 14E, the katana spinning like a helicopter's rotors, and 14E easily parried. 2E's sword spun around the length of her blade, filling the air with the screech of metal on metal as the trajectory and momentum of her weapon changed. It was a feint. While 14E was blocking the flying sword, 2E lunged forward, drove her leg into 14E's abdomen, grabbed onto the long Otoki as it flew from 14E's hand, and raised it above her head as 14E collapsed on the ground. 14E slowly began to clap, although her face remained a mask of stoicism. Rumor had it 14E had been built with a basic personality template developed from the commander, and although it was an unsubstantiated rumor with a roughly 0% chance of being true, anyone who knew her at least half believed it in spite of their better judgment. "Good work, 2E," said 14E. She stood up, taking her sword back from her apprentice. Light flashed across the Otoki's blood-spattered blade as 14E held her free hand to her chest. "Glory to mankind." 2E returned the salute. "Glory to mankind," she repeated. She breathed a sigh of relief as she collected her severed arm. The cut was completely clean, she wouldn't need any help reattaching it. Again. 2E dropped the arm and made a dash for her own sword just as 14E's Otoki cut into her midsection and tore through her abdomen, biting deeply but stopping just short of her black box. 14E yanked the sword out as 2E collapsed to the floor, her blood coating the mat as she writhed in agony. Her teeth gritted, her eyes squeezed shut, 2E clutched at the wound in her side as blood and coolant soaked through her clothes. The searing pain flowed through her body in throbbing waves from the gaping cut running nearly halfway across her torso all the way to the tips of her fingers and toes. 14E picked up her sheath and slid the sword into it. "You were doing well. The moment you failed was when you paused to bask in my adulation. Remember, pride, affection, happiness, sadness, love, hate, all androids must deny themselves these pleasures. But for a Type E especially, putting aside one's emotions is even more vital." 2E nodded and struggled to hold on to consciousness as her master lectured her. 14E knelt down beside her, retrieving a handful of tubes of staunching gel from the satchel at her side and applying them to 2E's wounds. At once the pain began to fade. "Who are you?" 14E asked 2E. "Yoarha number 2 Type E." "What do Type Es do?" "They kill." "What do they kill?" 2E was feeling more lightheaded by the second, but she completed the creed nonetheless. "Androids." 14E nodded as she helped 2E reattach her arm. "Machines are simple creatures," she reminded 2E, "with simple brains. One could hardly say they even have a survival instinct, merely the advantage of numbers. But androids will fight to their last breath. They will do anything and stoop to any low to cling to life, however futile it may be. 2E, what will you do the next time you hold your enemy's sword in your hand?" 2B raised her sword, took a deep breath of brisk, frigid air, and swung. With a satisfyingly meaty thwack, the virtuous contract sliced through a log of firewood and buried itself in the stump below. 2B tugged on the sword and the blade slid out as smoothly as butter. Over the past week as she'd settled in, she had often wondered if it was appropriate to use a weapon of such high caliber and exquisite craftsmanship for chopping firewood. But she had a certain kinship with this blade forged over dozens of battles and had no intention of leaving it behind simply because she had nobody to fight. 2B sheathed the blade at her side and collected the chopped sectors of firewood, carrying the quartered logs under her arm. The cold didn't bother her at all, one reason why she was still wearing her Yoarha dress uniform, despite how much of her legs it left bare, but there was something comforting about the sound and warmth of a roaring fire. That said, none of the wood was for her. 2B made her way to the outskirts of Snowdon, lingered around the perimeter as the town square began to empty, and left the fruits of her labors on top of the massive pile of wood resting under the tent erected in the center of town. A blizzard was on its way, heralded by the strong and bitter winds that pushed spinning vortexes of snow through the town's rustic streets, and every able-bodied citizen was doing their part to contribute to a communal war chest of kindling in preparation. One would give what they could and take what they needed. 2B and Nines offered plenty and took none, which had done much to endear them to the townsfolk. The two androids had been just a little concerned about staying in Snowdon at first, given that the Royal Guard had strict capture on-site protocols for alleged humans. But Papyrus had smoothed things over rather nicely with Dogami and Dogaressa, the two most senior members of the Snowdon chapter of the Guard. He had convinced the two of them that 2B and Nines were not, in fact, humans, but rather simply very unusual puppies who happened to smell very much like humans, or whatever it was monsters thought humans smelled like. The rest of the dogs fell in line behind them. What shocked 2B most of all was not that this ploy worked, but that Dogami and Dogaressa relied so much on their senses of hearing and smell. "So this is what you do now, huh?" A bright yellow flower with a brighter smile popped itself out of the thick blanket of snow covering the ground as 2B trudged through the snow, shaking the frost off of its petals. "Gosh, Chara, you've gotten boring." 2B reached for her sword, prompting Floey to immediately bolt back to the warmth and safety of his home beneath the soil before she could even slide so much as a centimeter of the blade out of its sheath. So there were still benefits to carrying around her sword. 2B stopped at a newsstand once she'd unloaded her share of the wood, ducking under the kiosk's snow-burdened awning to read the latest headlines. Rolling blackouts in new home, rumors of a possible food shortage in the months to come, costs of living in the city rising faster than wages. 2B had little context to understand such issues, but it seemed to her that peace was just as eventful as war in its own way. The long-eared, long-furred hare manning the kiosk cleared his throat and held out his paw, palm up. "Ahem. It's not a library, ma'am. That'll be 4GS. 2B barely heard him, because the photo front and center on the front page of the waterfall post was a blurry, indistinct photo of something she knew very well. The rusty, bullet-shaped chassis of a machine life form. Nines had mentioned to her that he'd run afoul of a few of the machines in Waterfall on his way to procure the parts 2B had needed just before she'd told him about the ghost that had been haunting her. The two of them had both agreed not to leap into battle until 2B was confident Chara was no longer influencing her. A week had gone by with no strange phantom symptoms and no visions or trances. 2B felt that perhaps she had successfully exorcised the spirit of Toriel's adopted child from her body. Perhaps it was time to make a move. "One copy of the Waterfall Post, please," a tall monster in a ragged, hooded cloak told the vendor, placing a few coins in his paw. The vendor pocketed the change and handed the newcomer a fresh newspaper. "Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am." He eyed 2B again. "Next time you want to read something without paying for it," he gestured to a building down the road with a sign out front reading, "Library." "Understood." 2B walked off, wishing she could learn more about that photo. The cloaked monster followed her. "It may not be the local paper," she said in a very familiar voice, "but I find the word search and crosswords in the post much more rigorous." "What is your name, dear?" 2B sighed. "Hello, Tori. SHH. Toriel raised a finger to her snout. "I would rather not attract undue attention here," she said. "To be honest, I believe my prolonged exile has given me a phobia of large crowds," she added, eyeing all two of the town square's current inhabitants, herself and 2B excepted. Toriel began unwrapping a long woolen scarf from around her neck. "Anyway, where are you staying now, my child?" "For your sake, I do hope it is close by," she said, rather forcefully ensconcing 2B in the scarf's thick, fuzzy folds. "With all the skin you are showing you will surely catch your death of cold out here." Again. 2B and Nines had taken up residence in a cottage on the river just outside of town which had just happened to have recently become vacant. A bearish monster named Ursel had lived there, but since he'd started to go bald, he'd been concerned about remaining in this perpetual winter wonderland. Nines had offered to take the house off the balding bear's hands, and now he and 2B owned it, or at the very least, squatted in it with the owner's permission. "Anything for friends of Papyrus," Ursel had said. Nines lay on his bed as he pored through the books he'd borrowed from the library, occasionally pausing when he felt the need to digest what he'd read, to glance out the window and watch the falling snow dust the trees outside. On occasion a bitter and forceful gust of wind roared around the cottage, rattling its windows and forcing groans and creaks from its wooden skeleton. The books Nines was reading were old tomes with brittle, yellowed pages and splotchy, once runny ink blots that had long since dried and faded. Nines handled them with the utmost care and respect as he deftly turned page after page, absorbing as much lore from the ancient kingdom as he could get his hands on. He wished these books had been digitized. He could process terabytes of text in a matter of seconds, but he couldn't help but admit there was a certain genius about doing things the analog way. At least with his visor on he could screenshot every page down to the last detail and commit them to local storage. As he studied, Nines had noticed something strange in this kingdom's history texts, not in the text itself, but in the illustrations accompanying them. The oldest books, the ones that had been preserved for thousands of years, all depicted human souls as a familiar heart shape and monster souls as an inverted heart. But the newer ones did not. Nines turned his attention to a far more recent history book, to a chapter which had caught his eye. A long time ago, a human named Chara fell into the ruins. Injured by their fall, they called out for help. The young Prince Asriel, the only son of King Ascari and Queen Toriel, heard their cries and brought them back to the castle. Over time, Asriel and Chara became like siblings, and the king and queen treated them as their own child. The unbreakable bond of friendship and fraternity that formed between human and monster filled the underground with hope. Then, one day, Chara became very ill. No physician could treat them, no magic could heal them. The sick human had only one last request: to see the flowers from their village one last time. But trapped as they were underneath the oppressive barrier, there was nothing even the king with all his might could do. After a long illness, the poor human died. Prince Asriel, racked with grief, absorbed Chara's soul and transformed into a being with incredible power. With the human soul, Asriel crossed through the barrier, carrying Chara's body into the sunset back to their home village. In the center of the village he found a bed of golden flowers, a perfect resting place for his dear friend. Suddenly, screams rang out. The villagers saw Prince Asriel holding the human's body. Thinking he had killed them, the other villagers assaulted him with every weapon at their disposal. Though he had the power to eradicate them all, he refused to fight back. Still clutching Chara's lifeless body, Asriel simply retreated with a smile on his face. Wounded, Prince Asriel stumbled home to the royal castle, where he collapsed in the center of his father's own garden. Soon he passed away from his wounds. With his death, the king, queen, and kingdom itself fell into despair. The illustration accompanying the story depicted in abstract, stylized, and long ago faded ink paintings, a human laying prone as a monster stood over them. The monster held an inverted heart between its paws, a standard representation of a monster's soul, but the human, in its upraised hand, cradled a black diamond instead of a heart. This was a recent story, relatively speaking. It hadn't started appearing in texts until a few centuries ago, but as soon as it had spread everywhere. It was the single most pivotal story in this kingdom's history since its founding. Nines wondered how the storytellers knew what Asriel had done on the surface, or if they were simply embellishing. Perhaps Asriel had lived long enough to tell someone in the garden where he'd died. No matter how many books told the story differently and illustrated it differently, there was one common thread to every retelling. With that story, artists had stopped drawing human souls as hearts and started depicting them as diamonds, or perhaps cubes. There came a knocking at the front door. Nines let the book he'd been reading join its companions in a growing stack at the side of his bed and got up, questions still buzzing around in his mind as he made his way down the hall to the door and cracked it open. 2B stepped over the threshold, brushing the snow off her dress and out of her windswept hair. A thick, long woolen scarf was draped haphazardly around her neck and shoulder. "Thank you, Nines. Much appreciated." 2B, you don't have to knock," Nines reminded her. "You live here." 2B blinked as she took a moment to wrap her head around that fact. "Right. Yes. Of course." The smallest hint of a self-effacing smile flickered on the corners of her mouth. "But it is only polite. After all, I have brought a guest with me." Toriel stepped over the threshold next, draping her snow-caked cloak on the coat rack by the side of the door. Upon seeing Nines, she immediately reached out to ruffle his hair. Nines had to admit he was surprised to see Toriel, that old hermit, out in the open. By her own admission, Toriel had not left her home in the ruins for centuries. However, since she had been spurred into action solely over her concern for 2B, she'd grown bolder. "Oh, what a lovely home you have found," Toriel told the two of them, taking in the cottage in all its rustic homeliness. She then shivered, pulling her cloak off the rack again. "But you have no heat. You do know all that wood in the town square is for everybody, right? Do you have enough blankets?" "The cold does not bother us," 2B answered, crossing her arms over her chest. I wasn't expecting visitors," Nines added, flustered. "Doesn't bother you, you say? But surely you cannot enjoy being so frigid." Toriel held a paw to 2B's cheek. "As I suspected. Frozen solid, ice cold, all the way through. You must think you deserve better than this, do you not?" "It doesn't matter," 2B insisted. "Nonsense." Toriel grabbed 2B and wrapped her rough, ragged cloak around the both of them. She shivered. 2B remained perfectly stoic as her head poked out next to Toriel's as if the two of them were a single entity with two heads. Nines suppressed a snicker, hiding his mouth behind his hand so 2B couldn't see him smiling. He'd never met anyone like Toriel before, but he most certainly would never have expected that she'd be allowed to pamper 2B so much. He got the feeling that if anybody else tried to do what Toriel was doing, they would be lucky to escape with all of their limbs intact. He certainly couldn't imagine 2B letting him do that to her. Toriel then examined the windows with a faint note of disapproval on her face, holding up her paw to the sill and noting the draft that came through. "Are you too sure you are prepared for the storm? Perhaps you should come back to the ruins tonight." "We assure you," said 2B, "that will not be." "Wait." Nines cut her off. "That reminds me. Toriel, I've been reading this place's history, and I'm sorry about what happened to your children." "Oh." Toriel looked away, her eyes downcast. Her voice dropped down to almost a whisper. "That's, Thank you." An idea struck Nines, albeit a morbid one. He needed confirmation of his theory, grisly as it was. "If there's any way 2B and I can pay our respects to them." "Pay your, Toriel seemed, if anything, more distressed now. Nines wasn't sure what to do. Androids didn't have children, so he wasn't entirely sure what the correct way of consoling a mother who'd lost hers was. "Yes," she said, after a long pause. "Thank you for offering. And sorry for the long pause." She smiled weakly in defiance of the tears glistening in her eyes and held up her paws. I was born with them." "Well," Toriel said, gesturing to an unadorned patch of dirt surrounded by yellow flowers, "this is it, my dears." It was near the same spot where 2B and Nines had landed. Their flight units were still standing right where they had left them, flanking the bare patch of earth. "You would have to travel all the way to Ascaris Castle to see where Asriel passed away. But this is where I laid Chara to rest." Toriel bowed her head, clasping her paws together, and despite what Chara had done to her 2B felt a sympathetic pang in her chest, as if the old monster woman's heartache were contagious. Emotions were contagious, weren't they? Like semi-benign logic viruses. 2B knew, for example, that if Nines started laughing, she would often feel just a little brighter, even if it was a confused, bittersweet kind of brightness sometimes. And, it seemed, the sadness of another person could wear on her own psyche as well. It was so strange that Toriel's sorrow over the death of her adopted child could be so palpable that 2B would start feeling the same way even toward the ghost that had wrought havoc within her mind. 2B tried to bury those thoughts, bury them like the corpse laid in repose beneath the soil. They weren't her thoughts or her feelings, she was borrowing them from Toriel. She wasn't even supposed to indulge in her own emotions, let alone somebody else's. But it didn't work. Those foreign emotions had lodged in her mind like parasites. And 2B didn't know how to get rid of them. When I came here, I brought their body with me," said Toriel. "I wished to give them a funeral fit for a human." A strained look crossed her face. You do bury humans, do you not?" "We do not bury humans," 2B answered. Toriel smiled a little, pained, self-effacing smile. Yes, I suppose you do not. Do you bury your fellow androids, then? Nines spoke up. Well, we 2B cut him off. We do, when we can. Every time she'd had to kill Nines, she'd buried the body, if possible. Mostly it was practical, just in case she ever crossed over that area again with the new Nines in tow. But she'd done it primarily because she felt it afforded him a sort of dignity not granted to soldiers who died alone in battle and whose corpses were scavenged and torn apart by scrounging machines or rogue androids. What do monsters do, Nines asked, when one of you dies? Our bodies do not linger after death, said Toriel, closing her eyes in a solemn reverie. The magic which holds our bodies together breaks down. We fall apart and become dust, and when one of us dies, we take that dust and spread it over the things they loved most, hoping to imbue it with their essence. 2B wondered where, if she were a monster, her dust would be left upon her death. It was a moot point, or at least it had been on the surface. An android was nothing if not the sum of its memories, and in a sense androids only died when their backups ceased to exist. It was no big loss if she and Nines died on a mission. They would find themselves in pristine bodies in a matter of minutes. But when 2B killed Nines and his backups were erased from the system, he would come back. He would always come back as a tabula rasa, one who had never met 2B and never remembered the missions they'd gone on or the enemies they'd faced or the asinine conversations they'd had. The one she knew always died. It wasn't like that anymore. Not down here. Maybe it would never be like that again. My child, Toriel whispered, jolting 2B out of her reverie, are you quite all right? 2B took a breath and found herself speechless. She simply reached over and laid her hand over Toriel's paw, and the borrowed ache in her chest began to fade away. A part of her wondered if the affection she felt for Toriel was her own, or simply some of Chara's feelings leaking into her mind, or whether it mattered. That night, long after Toriel had retired to bed, Nines pushed his shovel into the earth as he recounted what he knew to 2B. I also think, Nines added after regaling 2B with his theory, that when we exhume the body, we'll find something very important missing from it. If the legends were true, and the illustrations accurate, then a monster could absorb a black box just as it could a human soul and use it to escape the barrier, and perhaps the process would even also work in reverse. Nines knew that exhuming a dead body without its loved one's permission was almost perverse. But 2B had told him all about her encounter with Chara. Truth be told, desecrating their grave nearly gave him a sense of sick satisfaction. At last, Nines struck a body. Brushing the dirt away from it, his suspicions were confirmed. This was exactly where Toriel had claimed to have buried Chara, but the corpse beneath the soil was anything but human. The body's skin, hair, and clothes had long since dissolved and become one with the soil, revealing very clearly the nondescript, featureless gunmetal black chassis of an android. An old android, its design reminiscent of a long out-of-production model. Exactly as Nines and 2B had suspected. Nines knelt down and took the android's wrist, lifting its arm into the air. The skinless chassis, wreathed with synthetic musculature, was cold. There was, or at least there should have been, an IFF chip embedded deep in the right wrist, and although this android had been dead for centuries, it would only take the tiniest suggestion of electricity from his own body to run power through the chip long enough to get a reading from it. Within seconds data began scrolling across 9SS visor so quickly he could barely read it, culminating with, of all possible things, a Yorha production model number and type. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. YRHU13TC. C13. CTDSIS. Well? 2B asked him, reaching down and placing a hand over the heart-shaped locket draped over the android's skinless chest. What is it? Yorha Unit C13. Nines let the corpse's arm fall from his hand, dazed. He'd never heard of a character type before. But it's far too old, 2B pointed out. Yorha's first military engagement with the machines was only a few years ago. While black boxes had been developed during the 8th Machine War by the Council of Humanity, Yorha itself hadn't come into being until relatively recently, just before the opening salvos of the 14th Machine War. It wasn't surprising that an early prototype of what would eventually be a Yorha-type android could have fallen into this mountain over the past few centuries, but for it to carry recognizable IFF codes. I know it doesn't make sense. But that's what it is, said Nines. Possible explanations swirled around in his head. Perhaps Yoarha had been a clandestine espionage-based organization before its transition to a military force. What type is it? 2B asked. Type C. That's command type, right? Nines shook his head. Says here it stands for character, he replied. Infiltration and sabotage. Against what? He wondered. Machines. That's not a type I'm familiar with. 2B stepped back. Pod 042, do you have any records in local storage regarding Type C androids? Statement, no records of any such type exist, said the pod. If the IFF chip from this android is at all accurate, it is possible the existence of such a unit is highly classified. Strange. Nines had heard rumors that Type ES would go undercover as other models in order to get close to their targets, but that was it. A completely classified type was beyond belief. He turned to his own pod. What about you, 153? Pod 153 chimed in. Statement, this unit has no information regarding this so-called Type C android either. Perhaps it's a retired model, 2B said. Like the Type AS. You'd think there'd be historical records of them if that were true. Clearing his senses with a disappointed and dissatisfied shake of his head, Nines returned to C-13's corpse, popping off the chest plate and revealing the android's simple, outdated inner organs. There was, as he had predicted, a conspicuous absence where the black box should have rested. Could it be, Nines thought, his mind racing, that in the old story when Asriel claimed his friend Chara's soul, what he actually took was C-13's black box? And Nines stood up. And had he really been able to use it to escape the mountain? Was there a way out from under the barrier after all? At his side, 2B reached out and laid a hand on the android corpse's forehead, stiffened, and collapsed, nearly falling into the grave on top of Chara as Nines rushed to retrieve her. 2B was seeing through Chara's eyes again. She was lying in a bed, the covers drawn up to her neck and laying heavy on her body. She could barely breathe, the air stalled in her throat, hot and thick. Her sight was blurry, low resolution, low frame rate, waves of static rolling up and down. Asriel was sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed, cradling a black object in his cupped paws. The look on his face 2B could hardly make it out. Was it awe, or terror? This, Asriel blinked and looked up at her. This is your soul, Chara. His voice squeaked and cracked. Out of worry he'd lost weight. His familiar green sweater looked even larger on him than before and he was trembling, his thinning limbs like the last leaf remaining on a tree at the end of autumn. He handed the cube back to her. If I give it back, will you get better, he asked. Please. A black box. Her black box. No, Chara's black box. Even as 2B's vision continued to break down, she could see the glittering lines of white light across the cube's surface. She raised a weak, pale hand and pushed away Asriel's offering. You cannot go back now, she croaked. Take it. We will be strong together. Asriel looked down at the box in his paws. The sunset, Asriel. You'll see it tonight. And the moon. The little monster boy looked like he was about to cry. But Chara, he sniffled, tugging at his floppy ear and using it to wipe at his eyes. I'll be with you. Every step of the way. Asriel nodded. And once we're past the barrier, we just need 6 more of these, right? 2B nodded. And we'll only take them from bad people. Only the wicked, she assured Chara's adoptive little brother. Listen to me, Asriel. The surface is a dangerous place. When I came down here I brought my swords with me. Karnwenan and Khalidbolg. You'll need them. I left them right where you found me. Her vision flickered one last time and everything went black. Chara? Chara. 2B. When 2B opened her eyes, she had returned to reality. Nines had his arms around her waist as he hauled her out of the grave. As she stood up, Pod 042 hovered at her side and helped her prop herself up. It seems, she said, feeling as though she'd run 50 miles, you were correct, 9S. You had another vision? Nines inquired. 2B nodded. Asriel did take Chara's, their black box. She leaned against her shovel for support. I didn't see what happened next, though. Unit 2B, you appear to have suffered a minor seizure, Pod 042 warned her. Proposal, return home and run a complete hardware and software diagnostic. 2B didn't relish the thought of giving Nines so much work to do, but her pod was right. If she was still receiving visions, then Chara was still influencing her, although how she could not say. Right. But first, she speared a lump of loose dirt with her shovel and dumped it over Chara's body. We cannot let Toriel know we did this. Nines nodded in agreement and got to work. As the soil fell onto the long-dead android, 2B thought she saw, as impossible as it was, Chara's body twitch, and for an instant, she saw a pinprick of amber light flash in its dead optical sensors. She began shoveling the displaced dirt over Chara's body with frantic, zealous haste as if she were trying to put out a fire. Nines joined her, shoveling with manic fervor. Running through her subconscious was the primal half-thought that she and Nines had uncovered something that needed to be reburied as quickly as possible. Still panting and wiping sweat from clammy skin as she tamped down the soil and tried to make the grave look as undisturbed and pristine as possible, 2B realized that she was afraid. Not long after 2B and Nines had left the grave behind, a lone machine, a stubby model with a bullet-shaped body, tumbled from the ceiling and collapsed against the ground. It picked itself up gingerly, gazing up at the hole it had fallen through. It tried to contact its brothers on the surface but found every signal it tried to send jammed. It was disconnected from the network. For once in its short life, the machine was an individual, with only its own thoughts in its own head to keep it company. It was scared. The machine took a few hesitant steps forward. As it continued its scans, it noticed more of its kind deeper into the mountain, much, much deeper, trapped in the bowels of this strange place. Kindred. Family. Friends. The machine felt soft, churned up, spongy dirt under its foot. It paid this quirk of the landscape no mind until something wrapped around its metal ankle and pulled it into the ground. The machine let up a synthesized, ring-modulated scream as the hungry earth consumed it whole. A lone flower watched the events unfold with increasing interest. Ah, it said. So that's where you've been hiding, Chara. Chapter 10, See a Date with Undyne. Wanted, alive. 9S. For the following crimes: assault, child endangerment, possession of a human soul without a license, resisting arrest, breaking and entering, public indecency. Continued on back. 10,000 G reward. Nines looked at his own face on the wanted poster he'd snatched from the post in the town square and groaned. They'd picked an embarrassing still from his televised appearance that made him look half asleep, a slack-jawed expression on his face. Give me a break. I know, right? Sans set down a ragged stack of identical posters he and Papyrus had collected from all over Snowdin on the table and yawned. If I were a bounty hunter, I wouldn't get out of bed for 10,000 G. You're worth at least 11 grand. Thanks, Sans. Nines crumpled up the poster and tossed it onto the floor. Is that all of them? 2B asked, flipping through the stack. I'm surprised, she added, at how slowly it took to get the word out like this. Snow must have held them off. Nines glanced out the window of the cottage. Snowdrifts reached halfway up the glass, dumped from the blizzard that had raged through yesterday. He and 2B had made sure to help clear the townsfolk's doors of snow. With any luck, after receiving the benefits of so much philanthropy, the monsters living here would take their side over the royal guard, but Nines felt that was unlikely. It must have taken a while to draw up all these trumped-up charges. Papyrus said, pounding his fist. At the very worst, you're only guilty of 3 of these things, 9S. It doesn't matter, 2B coldly replied, if he has broken 1 law or 100. If either or both of us are accosted by the royal guard on suspicion of being human, it might not end well for us. Sorry for getting you involved in this, Papyrus. Nines started idly ripping up another poster. Guess being friends was just a nice thought. Sorry for what? I mean, it's gonna be pretty hard to stay in Undyne's good graces if she finds out you're harboring a criminal in this town, right? Nines asked. Papyrus slammed his fists down on the table so hard that his diminutive older brother fell to the floor. I've got it. We need you to make friends with Undyne. Nines was speechless. What? 2B responded, so shocked by Papyrus' plan that she'd forgotten to sound surprised. Undyne is the second most powerful monster in the kingdom. King Ascari trained her himself. If we prove to her your good intentions, everything will work out. Papyrus insisted. And I know just how to do it. Later the next day, 2B and Nines took the boat from Snowdon to Waterfall, intending to rendezvous with Papyrus near Undyne's house. The river person who rowed the boat downstream made no attempt at conversation, but occasionally threw out cryptic statements such as, "Did you know that a spider's favorite food is other spiders?" 2B flipped through the latest newspaper from Waterfall, scanning for any further news about machine life forms. Nothing had shown up since the sightings from earlier. Apparently, they were regarded as local nuisances, albeit dangerous ones, the same way one would regard wild animals living in the woods. As far as 2B could infer, they never appeared in large numbers and never attacked if they were outnumbered. They must have been cut off from the machine's global network, just as 2B and Nines were cut off from Yorha, and thus incapable of complex tactics. She ended up doing the crossword puzzle. It was surprisingly easy, even the hints that depended on pop culture, as most of the answers to those ones were simply met at an. Papyrus had shown her the footage from the Mechanical Pop Stars show in which Nines had appeared, as it was the reason for the so-called public indecency charge listed on his wanted poster. Nines pulled up his hood, taking a page from Toriel as far as disguises went, as the river passed by a trio of monsters camping out in the reeds lining the riverbank. "Hey, 2B. She set down the newspaper. "Is something wrong, 9S? Nah. Just wanted to know if you were alright." 2B nodded. She hadn't had any more visions or strange medical issues in the few days since the two of them had exhumed Chara's body. "Yes. I appreciate your concern." Nines laughed. "You'd better. 'Cause you're stuck with it." Perhaps, 2B thought, knowing how morbid the idea was, what remained of Chara's soul left my body and flowed into their own when I reached out and laid my hand on their chest. It was funny. She had never thought of her kind as having souls. Nobody had ever said that androids could have souls. But 9SS research hinted at the possibility. There was a certain amount of dramatic irony, 2B realized, in the conversation she'd had with King Ascari. She'd convinced him that the black boxes he'd been collecting were useless to him and his people. In fact, it now seemed increasingly likely they'd been exactly what he'd needed all along, and if she hadn't reset time, she still wasn't sure how she'd done that, then Ascari would have had the 7 souls he needed to break the barrier and free his people. The black box humming in 2B's chest, it was a power source, a central processor, and a self-destruct device, under the right conditions and in desperate circumstances. Could it also somehow act as a receptacle for a soul? Had androids, crafted in mankind's image, somehow gained over the millennia the most intangible and unreachable portion of human nature? Was it an emergent feature of their consciousness? 2B petted Pod 042 on its boxy head as it floated by her side. She found herself idly wondering if even a support pod could have a soul. The boat came to a stop at the dock, jolting 2B out of her increasingly philosophical musings. As her boots touched the soft, yielding soil of the riverside, she felt a growing sinking feeling in her stomach. She and Nines were, for tactical and entirely selfish reasons, going to find and befriend a monster she had last seen standing over 9SS corpse. Captain Undyne of King Ascari's Royal Guard. Papyrus met the androids in a path through the gloomy marshland. He was all smiles, of course, and 2B could see Nines trying to adopt at least a bit of his cheerful demeanor. All 2B felt was tense. Her sword was, of course, sheathed. If the situation turned bad, would she be able to draw it and run to 9SS defense in time? When the two of them had fought Undyne, what should have been the captain's last attack had only struck and killed Nines because 2B had been an agonizingly long split second too slow to bring down a shield to protect him. Could she protect him this time? The trio came up to a small house that somehow seemed to resemble its tenant. Maybe it was the scale-like shingles. Maybe it was the front porch and door like the toothy maw of some grotesque deep-sea creature. Maybe it was the veins protruding like fins or the porthole windows like glassy eyes. Whatever it was, the house was fishy. Papyrus walked up to the porch, rapped on the door, and waited patiently. Well, Nines whispered to 2B, "Are you ready to hang out with Undyne?" 2B clenched her jaw so hard she thought she could feel a tooth crack. The door opened in front of Papyrus, revealing Captain Undyne wearing a ragged and casual ensemble belying her rank. "Oh, hey, Papyrus. Ready for your super special, extra private, one-on-one training?" There was an eager, ravenous glow to her smile, as dull and yellowed as her fangs were. "You bet I am." Papyrus stepped aside. "And I brought friends." "Well, that kinda goes against the extra private thing, but," Undyne smiled. "Sure. The more, the mere." She looked at Nines, her lips curling. She looked at Papyrus. Papyrus said nothing. She looked at Nines again, and then at 2B. Her eye held a strange mix of skepticism, confusion, and utter loathing. 2B clenched her fists so hard that she nearly punctured her palms, thankful to be wearing her visor. "Why don't you three come inside?" Undyne asked, chewing and spitting out each word before it left her mouth. Undyne stepped back into her house. Papyrus glanced back at the androids. "This is going great," he whispered to them before he followed his captain over the threshold. Nines stepped forward, 2B following at his side. She noticed that the captain's porch had a welcome mat shaped like a fish skeleton. No wonder she and Papyrus were friends. The two androids found themselves inside a house that was just a little less bizarre on the inside as it was on the outside. Antique swords and spears and a few strange, colorful illustrations lined the walls, breaking up the fish-patterned wallpaper. There was a little aquarium filled with balls of moss sitting on a stained and worn table. The kitchen was the largest room, at least from what 2B could see, and the mess piled up on the counters made her lose what little of an appetite she possessed. "Well," said Undyne, pushing the kitchen table into the corner with her foot, "I guess we'll get started." She seemed to have decided that her best course of action was to simply ignore Papyrus guests. "Hope you brought plenty of bones, Papyrus, because I'm..." Papyrus raised his hand. "Excuse me, Undyne. I need to use the bathroom." Undyne sighed and rolled her eye. "Fine. Make it quick." "Oh, I shall." Papyrus shouted, and with a flourish of his scarf, he jumped out the window. Nines let out the most uncomfortable and smallest attempt at a laugh 2B had ever heard. "Does he, do that often?" Undyne glanced out the window. "No. Normally he nails the landing. Anyway." She crossed her bare arms over her chest, muscles rippling beneath her scales. A lock of crimson hair that had pulled free of her ponytail fell over her eye patch. "If it isn't the Underground's most wanted. Here to turn yourself in? Or was humiliating me in Hotland not enough for you?" "I'm not here to turn myself in," Nines said, shrugging off his cloak. Undyne's smile turned into a fierce grin. "NGH. All right, then. Well, I've got news for you, you little brat. You're on my court now. You aren't making a mockery of me again." By instinct, 2B stepped between her partner and Undyne, the shining tip of her sword instantly at Undyne's throat. Undyne simply laughed, laying the back of her hand across the flat of 2B's blade and pushing it aside. "Step aside, Zatoiki. You want a rematch, don't you? What was your name, again?" 9S. 2B gritted her teeth. "You'll have to go through me first. 042, take aim." "Easy, 2B. Nines pulled down his visor and held up his hands. "We're here to make peace, not fight." "Make peace? Are you kidding?" Undyne clenched her fists. "You unbelievable pieces of rotting, fly-covered, weak old sashimi. The gall you two have. You're the enemies of everybody's hopes and dreams here in this kingdom, as if swearing on a live TV show beloved by all of the children wasn't bad enough. If you weren't my house guests, I'd beat you both into chum right here." Flecks of spittle flew from her mouth with reckless abandon. "As if I'd ever be friends with such shining examples of human achievement." "Android," Nines corrected. Papyrus' voice drifted through the broken window. "Oh, hello, Sans. Thank you so much for calling me on my cell phone, which I definitely brought with me." "What? Oh, the bet. I'm afraid it's not looking too good for Undyne. I thought she would be up to the challenge of befriending our two guests, but it seems she is not as brave or as competitive as I thought. I guess I do owe you all of my money. NGH. Damn it, Undyne stepped back, tossed her hair back, and growled with irritation. Fine. Here's what's gonna happen. She took a seat on top of the table, leaning back casually while crossing her legs. The three of us? We're gonna hang out. We're gonna have a good time. We're gonna be friends. Best friends. What is she doing? 2B kept a tight grip on her sword as Pod 042 floated at her side, ready to fire on her command. Is this some kind of psychological tactic? Or does she really wish for Papyrus to win his wager? It occurred to 2B that this was the first she'd heard of Papyrus making a bet with his brother. It occurred to her that he probably hadn't. And it occurred to her that this was all part of some Machiavellian plan to trick Undyne into befriending her and Nines. She hadn't expected Papyrus to be anything other than an endearingly guileless bumbler, but there he was, shrewder than she'd anticipated. Nines shared a befuddled glance with 2B. Did we just win? He asked 2B. 2B tentatively lowered her sword. She didn't recognize this side of Undyne at all. The Undyne she knew was passionate, vengeful, ruthless, prideful, single-minded, tunnel-visioned. On second thought, this Undyne was actually just like the Undyne she'd fought to the death. All right, new pals, Undyne chirped, rubbing her hands, why don't you two take a seat? 2B and Nines took their places around the table as Undyne slid off it. The last time 2B had felt so uneasy and unnerved, she'd been walking into a supposedly resistance-controlled factory filled with machines lying in wait to ambush her. Comfy? Let me get you something to drink. Undyne started pulling drinks out of her cabinets. Let's see. Hot chocolate, nah, that's empty. She tossed a can over her shoulder. Sugar, that's for the tea. Soda. You guys want a soda? Said 2B. Sure, said Nines. Undyne threw the bottle on the floor. It shattered, spreading a pale blue-greenish liquid across the linoleum floor. No, you don't. It rots your teeth. It rots your mind. It rots your fighting spirit. She looked down at the mess she'd made. How about some tea? Actually, 2B said, I am not thirsty. Tea it is. Undyne produced a kettle, laid it on top of the stove, and filled it with water. So, you guys are sword fans, huh? I guess, said Nines. I've loved swords ever since I first saw one, Undyne mused wistfully. It was in the garbage dump way down in the depths of Waterfall. You know. In the ravine. Alphys and I found lots of human stuff down there. Course, you gotta be careful down there nowadays, those damn tin cans. Nines cleared his throat. Why yeah, about those tin cans, I think we might. The kettle cut him off with a keening whistle. Here we go. Undyne shouted out, bringing over 3 cups of hot water and 4 packets of tea. And which one of my new special friends gets the extra tea bag? Of course my good, bestest new bestie, she pointed at Nines. 9S, Nines answered. Right. 2B looked into her own cup as the tea began to seep into the still boiling water, lending it a familiar golden color. Captain, where did you get this tea? Undyne leaned on the table with her elbows. Oh, don't captain me, pal. How would you like it if I called you ma'am instead of hey, what's your name, again? 2B stiffened. 2B. And I do not appreciate being called ma'am. We're so alike. Undyne smiled so saccharinely that 2B could feel her own teeth rotting, even though that was impossible. We really are gonna be besties. You don't know how to do anything but kill, do you? Once she'd given the tea enough time to steep, 2B took a long draught. And then she had the answer to her question about the tea. She was thankful she had her visor on. A tear had sprung unbidden from her eye, and the visor hid it from sight and sopped it up. A gesture of kindness from the king when she had least expected it, or deserved it. Oh, yeah. I got this tea from King Ascari. It's the big guy's favorite blend. Undyne downed the entire cup's worth in one gulp. What do you think, 9S? Nines tried the tea. It's pretty good, he agreed. You know, you actually remind me a lot of Ascari. Undyne reached over and clapped him on the shoulder. It's no wonder Papyrus ended up friends with you, poor guy. Poor guy. Nines repeated. You're not gonna turn him away from the guard for not turning us in, are you? Undyne shook her head. No way. He's loyal to the end. So loyal it wraps right around to him being loyal in the wrong direction sometimes. He'd never make it into the Royal Guard anyway, though. She sighed. He's tough. He's strong. He's got a bigger heart than King Fluffy Buns himself. But I could never give him an actual position on the front line. He'd get ripped to shreds and he'd be smiling the whole time. If anything bad ever happened to him, I would kill everyone who got in my way and then myself. 2B let out a bitter smile. It seemed she and Undyne weren't so different. That was almost exactly what she'd done after Undyne had. After 2B stood up, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. It really sickens me, you know? To see you so mad about your friend. Like you deserve to be mad. Undyne, 2B hissed through gritted teeth. 2B could still vividly see the blank look on 9S's face as the captain's bolt of lightning, thrown the way Zeus would throw his from atop Mount Olympus, bored through his head. 2B could still vividly recall the pain she'd felt watching Nines die and how much angrier she had been to see the deed done by a hand other than her own. No. She had to bury these irrational feelings. Just because she had seen it and felt it didn't mean it had happened. Nines was still alive. Undyne hadn't killed him. Why did she still hate Undyne so much for killing Nines, especially if it hadn't happened anymore? Was it because 2B couldn't hate herself any more than she already did? Remember your mission, 2B, she told herself. Right now, befriending Undyne is the best way to keep Nines and yourself out of harm's way. Undyne rose to her feet. Oh, I get it. I know exactly what kind of person you are. Your buddy Nines is chatty, but you're the kind of girl who does her talking with her weapons, eh? A competitive gleam shone in her eye. Why don't we do something a little more your speed, 2B? Let's head on over to the garbage dump. Undyne flung out her arms, gesturing to the mounds of trash surrounding her and the two androids. She'd gone completely quiet on her way down to the depths of Waterfall, breaking her silence only to finish the sentence she'd started back in her kitchen. She had vehemently shushed both 2B and Nines, and their pods, any time they tried to speak up on the way here. How strange. Alphys and I used to hang out here a lot, Undyne said. Fun stuff from the surface falls down here all the time. Weapons, computers, these historical records Alphys calls anime. 2B eyed one of the mounds, spying the shattered head of a machine life form. Its cracked spherical surface had caved in, revealing the mechanisms beneath. For some reason, even though these things didn't have mouths, beneath their carapaces was a full set of teeth. 2B had never learned why, and, quite frankly, she didn't want to know. And machines. Nines pulled a battered little figurine out of the garbage. What is this? Some kind of ancient human fertility idol. Undyne snatched it out of his hands and shoved it into her pocket. Oh, I've been looking for a Nyanko-chan figurine to complete my collection for years. This friendship's already paying off. She rubbed her hands together gleefully. All right, 2B, ready for a rough, reckless female bonding experience you'll never forget. 2B adjusted her hairband. If you are attempting to court me, it will not work. Undyne ignored her. We're going robot hunting. Just the two of us and Nines. Nothing strengthens the bond between friends like bloodshed on the battlefield. A spear blazed to life in her hand. Draw your weapons, and, she squinted at 2B. You sure you can fight in that getup? 2B looked down at her dress. Everything seemed to be in order. This is my uniform, she said. What are you? Undyne scoffed. A maid. No. I was designed for combat. 2B spied an old Type 3 sword buried in the rubble and pulled it free, eager to have a weapon in both hands once again. In high heels. You don't wear them. Undyne sighed and led 2B and Nines deeper into the tunnels far below the inhabited portions of Waterfall. 2B could tell from the wooden and metal beams propping up the tunnel walls here and there that at one point, monsters had at least tried to mine something out of the earth here, although they'd long since given up. Perhaps they'd been forced out. Tin cans don't often go past the junk heaps, Undyne explained, her spear casting an eldritch blue-green glow across the cavern walls in addition to the brighter beacons emanating from the android's support pods. So I think they live really deep down here. We've just been sort of ignoring them and hoping they leave us alone. Peace by mutual disinterest. It sounded nice. 2B wished it could be that way on the surface, too. With a sudden, vehement outburst, Undyne slammed her spear into the tunnel wall. But I've had it with them. Kids aren't smart enough to run away when they see those machines, damn it. Especially with their big, adorable heads. She yanked the spear out of the wall, taking with it a chunk of rock stuck to the edge. 2B, Nines, if you two can prove you're both friends of justice by killing at least half as many machines as me, I think we're gonna be pretty good pals. With a slice from 2B's blade and a gust of wind, oil and coolant gushed from a widening hole in the chest of a battered, rusty, moss-covered machine life form. See. Come, it growled. Join the fun. About to strike the killing blow, 2B hesitated. Machines weren't supposed to be able to talk. Nines stole the kill, lancing the stubby machine through its head. 13. Undyne grumbled as she forced a bip to the ground and drove a spear through its chest. 21. Kman, 2B, get your act together, Nines called out with a rakish grin. I'm catching up to you. 2B pushed on ahead, cutting down another machine standing in her way. It let out a high-pitched, modulated gurgle as it fell to its knees with a gap in its abdomen. Oil and coolant poured from the breach in its carapace as its fingers scrabbled at the wound. 18, she said. Oh. Snow, WY. 2B shook off the feeling of unease growing in the back of her mind. Machines weren't conscious beings. They must have picked up a habit of feigning consciousness to distract androids like her. That was all. Another bip, this one clad in ragged clothing. Another new sight for 2B brought an axe down over 2B's head. 2B held out her sword, parrying the rusted and misshapen blade. Fight. Act. Item. Mercy. Mercy. This didn't feel much like a game to 2B anymore. She staggered back under the force of the blow. They're talking. A glowing spearhead tore through the machine's neck, and its red optical sensors instantly went dark. 23, Undyne purred. You're welcome. A machine arm crashed against 2B's shoulder, knocking her off her feet. Pod 042 whirled around and lit up the cave with a spray of bullets as it laid into the offending machine. Stay here with me. 2B got up and cut the machine off at the knees as its eyes flickered and died. 19. She checked her shoulder. Bruised, sore, but uninjured. Nines shouted out as a machine outfitted with oversized claws took a swipe at him, ripping into his coat. 2B's ears perked up at the sound of his peril and ran to his aid, driving both her swords into the machine's shoulders. With a fluid twist, she removed both its arms and kicked it into the wall. The machine's back collided with a luminescent crystal embedded in the wall, which broke through its carapace and impaled the machine. But nobody came. Nines picked himself up. Thanks, 2B. That's 20 for you, right? I'm not having fun with this anymore, 2B replied, hurrying after Undyne. A 12-foot Goliath class with piston-powered arms burst through the tunnel wall in front of Undyne as she ran ahead, getting the drop on her. Haha. I remember. As 2B hesitated, Nines patted her on the shoulder. Listen to them. It's just gibberish, 2B. These things aren't really thinking or feeling. He tossed his sword at the machine, leaving a deep score in its massive forearm before the sword dutifully returned to his hand. Sometimes 2B felt that Nines relished killing machines more than she did. Undyne tore through the bestial machine with a salvo of energy spears. This one counts for 3, she shouted as the machine groaned and staggered back. Lorem ipsum docet, the machine groaned as it brought its fists down on the ground, shaking the whole tunnel. These types of machines, a colony of smaller machines joined together into a single unit, were difficult to fight and avoid in close quarters. The shockwave from the impact pinned 2B against the wall. She felt some of her innards uncomfortably compress. 2B, get back. Nines called out as he struck at the Goliath machine's comparatively skinny bicep, nearly severing it. "I'm gonna hack it. Become one of us," the machine groaned. Nines gritted his teeth with exertion as he bypassed the machine's defenses. Seized by an outside force, the commands Nines was sending to its motor systems, the machine yanked its own forearm off. 2B felt a prickling sensation run up her spine and quickly became aware of an uncomfortable presence in the back of her mind, the presence of a third limb. The machine's disembodied arm floated in the air at 2B's beck and call, linked to her NFC system through 9S's hacking. "I've got it slaved to your system, 2B, Nines growled, still straining himself against the machine's strong, if stupid, mind. Finish him quickly." 2B curled the machine's fingers into a fist, her own arm mirroring its movements, and socked the Goliath machine in the torso. It staggered back, flailing its remaining arm as a single lance of lightning shot through its chest, killing it. "That counts for me," Undyne crowed. 26. As the machine shut down and 2B felt the slaved limb fade away from her mind, Nines screamed out and reeled backward. 2B rushed to his side as he hit the ground. 9S, what's wrong? Come join the fun, he droned as if in a trance. He shook his head like a dog drying itself off and hissed through gritted teeth. And nothing. These guys are full of corrupted data. It just hurts to read it. I'm fine. Ow. You guys are losing your head start. Undyne taunted, placing her hands on her hips. It's about quantity, not quality. As Undyne threw back her head and laughed, another Goliath-class machine crawled out of the darkness behind her, raising its fists. It's a real get-together. Pod. 2B shouted. Spear. At 2B's command, her pod planted a forest of energy spears not too different from Undyne's in the ground. As they burst up from the ground like stalagmites of pure light, the spears impaled the machine, grievously injuring it. Undyne whirled around and stuck it through the head with a spear of her own. The machine collapsed. Flattery, Zatoiki. Undyne flashed a snaggle-toothed grin. Maybe you two aren't too bad. She threw a spear. 2B's first instinct was to dive in front of Nines and protect him, but the lightning javelin sailed overhead and blew off the head of a machine that had snuck up behind her. "Dollarum ipsum docet," Nines muttered, collapsing as he tried to stand up. Sweat beaded his brow. "Undyne, we should head back," 2B suggested, helping Nines up as he continued to mutter the same nonsense 2B had heard the machines repeating. She cursed her rotten luck. 153, prepare a logic virus vaccine. I think 9SS picked something up. Undyne rushed over to the android's side. What's wrong with him? No, Nines protested, I am fine. Come join the fun. 2B laid him down. Try not to think too hard, she cautioned him, worrying all the while as she pulled down his visor to get a glimpse of his eyes. She prayed it wasn't serious. Ha. You're a hoot, 2B. Nines opened his eyes, and to 2B's horror she saw the faintest flicker of red light behind his pupils, so faint, she might have brushed it off as her imagination. A pinprick of red ringed with the blue of his irises, the hallmark of a logic virus infecting his mind. She'd seen androids infected by logic viruses before. Sometimes the sickness progressed quickly, sometimes slowly. It always ended, if the virus couldn't be purged first, with the sufferer losing all sense of reason and going berserk. 153, how's that vaccine coming? 2B barked, feeling trapped by the passage of time as she hoped the virus wouldn't metastasize too quickly. If it spread through his cognitive core too quickly and became incurable, Nines would be lost. He'd become a danger both to himself and everyone around him, and 2B would have to. She would have to. 2B would. No, 2B told herself. Never again. Pod 153 handed her a syringe. 2B immediately brought it to 9SS neck, stuck him with the needle, and pressed down on the plunger until the syringe's contents were depleted. Nines shuddered, convulsed, and went limp in 2B's arms, blinking profusely as the red light faded from his eyes. 2B breathed a sigh of relief as she held him tighter, unaware that she'd been holding her breath. Statement, virus eliminated, Pod 153 informed 2B as it hovered at 9SS side. Nines pressed his fingers against his temples as 2B and Undyne helped him to his feet. Ow. Stupid 9S. Wow, said Undyne. When you said you were a robot I thought you were just lying. Android, Nines corrected. Another machine stumbled out from the darkness, a short, stubby model. As Undyne grabbed Nines under his armpits and kept him steady, 2B drew her swords, ready to defend Nines from any further attack. The machine took a few unsteady, halting steps and raised a trembling hand. Its optical sensors glowed green and a ring-modulated voice, soft and childlike in its pitch and cadence, issued forth from its speakers. Mom. Dad. Where am I? What's happening? 2B froze as the machine took a few more unsteady steps toward her. What happened to me? Where am I? Is that you, Chara? A 2B paused, her voice stuck in her throat. Though masked by the heavy, harsh electronic modulation, the voice that machine spoke with was familiar. Real. Check the description for the links to the author.